About 3,800 years ago, long before the idea of skyscrapers or traffic jams ever crossed a human mind, you find yourself standing in the soft glow of early morning outside a city that already feels impossibly alive. The air is warm, carrying a faint scent of river water and sun-baked clay, and ahead of you rises Babylon, vast and patient, its mud-brick walls catching the first light of dawn like a slow awakening giant. You are not rushing. There is no need. Time moves differently here, stretching and folding in a way that feels almost designed to quiet your thoughts. A faint breeze brushes your skin, and for a moment it feels as though you are simply another traveler arriving after a long journey, your sandals dusted with pale earth, your curiosity gently pulling you forward. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, perhaps wrapped in a blanket, or resting your head against something soft, you might want to share where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. There is something quietly comforting about knowing that while you listen, others are drifting into this ancient place from their own distant corners of the present. Now dim the lights, and without ceremony you begin to move. The walls of Babylon rise before you, thick and sun-warmed, built from countless mud bricks pressed by human hands. Records confirm that cities in Mesopotamia relied heavily on these materials, as stone was rare in the region, and yet the scale here still surprises you. The walls do not feel temporary. They feel deliberate, protective, almost proud. Your fingers brush the surface as you walk closer, and you can feel the roughness beneath your touch, each brick slightly uneven, as though holding a memory of the person who shaped it. A curious footnote whispers through your thoughts. Some bricks in ancient Mesopotamia were stamped with the names of kings, a quiet reminder of power pressed into something as ordinary as clay. In the distance you hear movement, the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet. Babylon is waking up. You follow the sound, your steps slow, unhurried, as the ground beneath you shifts from loose dust to a more compacted path. Ahead, figures begin to take shape in the morning light. Traders with bundles tied in cloth, farmers leading animals, a child trailing behind, half awake, half curious. No agreement has been reached on whether Babylon at this time was already the largest city in the world, or simply one of several major urban centers competing for that title. But standing here, it feels vast enough to hold every story you can imagine. The sky above you is pale, almost colorless, slowly deepening into soft gold. You notice how the city does not wake all at once. Instead, it stirs in layers. A door opens somewhere behind the walls. A distant call echoes faintly. A cart creaks into motion. For a moment you pause. There is something oddly familiar about it all. Not the architecture or the clothing, but the rhythm. The quiet before activity. The sense that behind every wall someone is stretching, preparing, beginning again. You step closer to the entrance where the wall opens into a wide gate. Even from here you can see that it is more than just a passage. It is a checkpoint, a threshold between outside and inside, between uncertainty and structure. The ground near the gate is worn smooth from countless footsteps. You imagine how many people have passed through here. Merchants hoping for profit, messengers carrying news, families returning home. Oddly enough, some ancient travelers believed cities like Babylon were not just physical places, but living entities with spirits or protective forces tied to their walls. Standing here, you can almost understand why. The city feels aware, as though it notices your presence. A pair of guards stands near the entrance, their posture alert but not aggressive. They are watching, always watching. You notice the way they observe each person who approaches, their gaze steady, practiced. Records confirm that city gates in Mesopotamia were critical points of control, where goods could be inspected and movement monitored. This is not just an opening in a wall. It is a place where order is maintained. As you wait your turn to enter, you become aware of the small details around you. The faint smell of animals, the texture of woven baskets, the soft murmur of conversation in a language that feels both distant and strangely rhythmic. One scandalous aside drifts into your thoughts. Some historians have suggested that bribery at city gates was not entirely unheard of, though evidence is scattered and debated. You glance at the guards again, wondering how much has really changed across the centuries. Scholars bicker over how strictly these entry points were enforced. Were they rigid and controlled, or more fluid, adapting to the needs of daily life? As you stand here, the answer seems to rest somewhere in between. A man ahead of you gestures as he speaks to a guard pointing toward the bundles he carries. The guard nods, perhaps satisfied, perhaps simply accustomed to the routine. There is no visible tension, only a quiet understanding of roles. You shift your weight slightly, feeling the ground firm beneath your feet. The sun climbs a little higher, warming your shoulders. Somewhere behind you, a bird calls out, its voice sharp and brief. And then, almost without noticing the exact moment it happens, you are moving forward again. Closer to the gate now, the scale becomes even more apparent. The walls tower above you, their edges softened by time but still imposing. You pass beneath the shadow they cast, and the temperature drops slightly, the air cooler, calmer. For a moment, it feels as though you are stepping out of one world and into another. Inside, the sounds grow louder, more layered, more alive. But you do not rush. Instead, you let yourself linger in this threshold space, this quiet in between, because this is where it begins. Not with grand monuments or dramatic events, but with a simple act, crossing into a city where thousands of lives unfold, each one as ordinary and complex as your own. And as you take that final step forward, you carry with you the sense that Babylon is not just a place you are visiting. It is a place you are about to inhabit. The shade of the gate lingers on your shoulders for a moment longer, and then you are fully inside, where the light feels softer, filtered through dust and motion. The air changes, too. It carries the scent of people now, warmth, woven cloth, a hint of livestock, and something faintly sweet that you cannot quite place yet. You do not walk far before the rhythm of the entrance reveals itself. The gateway is not just a passage. It is a place of pause, of inspection, of quiet negotiation. People do not simply drift through. They slow, adjust their posture, prepare to be seen. To your left, a man balances a bundle wrapped in rough fabric. He shifts it from one shoulder to the other, exhaling slowly, as if rehearsing patience. Ahead, a woman holds a small basket, her fingers resting lightly on its rim, her expression calm but attentive. No one seems surprised by the delay. This is expected. This is routine. Records confirm that the Babylonian city gates functioned as administrative checkpoints, where goods could be taxed and movement observed, and you can feel that structure in the way the guards stand, in the way the crowd subtly organizes itself into a loose order. You move with them, step by step, your pace, guided by the slow forward pull of the line. The ground beneath your feet is smoother here, worn down by years of passing sandals, carts, and hooves. Occasionally you feel a slight dip or ridge, a reminder that even the most traveled paths are shaped by time. A guard glances in your direction, not sharply, not suspiciously, but with a practiced awareness. His clothing is simple but functional, and at his side hangs a weapon that looks both familiar and distant in design. He does not speak to you, not yet, but his presence is enough to make you aware of yourself, of your place here. Oddly enough, some guards in ancient cities were not full-time soldiers, but men drawn from the local population serving in rotating duties. You imagine them returning home after their shift, stepping out of this watchful role and back into the ordinary rhythm of family life. It makes the moment feel less rigid, more human. A cart creaks forward beside you, its wooden wheels complaining softly with each turn. The driver clicks his tongue, guiding the animal, pulling it, while a second guard steps closer, peering into the contents. There is no rush, but there is no neglect either. Every movement has purpose. No agreement has been reached on whether these inspections were primarily about security or taxation. Some argue they were strict economic tools, ensuring the city collected its share. Others suggest they also served as a subtle way to maintain order, reminding everyone that entry into Babylon was a privilege, not a given. You notice how people respond. No one protests, no one argues loudly. There are small gestures, quiet exchanges, a nod here, a brief word there. It is a system understood without needing explanation. The sounds here are layered in a way that almost feels deliberate. The low hum of conversation blends with the occasional sharp call of a guard, the shuffle of feet, the soft rustle of fabric. Somewhere nearby, metal lightly tapped against metal, perhaps a tool being adjusted or a weapon being checked. Your ears begin to pick out patterns, the rhythm of movement, the pauses, the subtle shifts when someone is stopped for a little longer than usual. It is not chaotic. It is controlled, but gently so. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are whispers scattered across time, suggesting that certain traders could pass more easily than others, especially if they carried the right connections or offerings. You glance at the guards again, wondering how much of that is truth and how much is speculation shaped by human nature. The line moves again, and now you are closer to the heart of the checkpoint. A guard steps toward the man with the fabric bundle you noticed earlier. He gestures lightly, and the man lowers it to the ground. The cloth is loosened, revealing goods inside. You cannot see clearly, but the guard's eyes scan quickly, efficiently. A council decree proves that Babylonian authorities were deeply concerned with regulating trade, particularly items that could affect the economy or the temple system. Even here in this simple inspection, you sense that larger structure at work. When the guard nods, the man gathers his bundle again, relief passing across his face in a way that is small but unmistakable. He moves on, disappearing into the deeper streets of the city. Now it is nearly your turn. You become aware of your breathing, slow and steady. There is no real danger here, no immediate threat, and yet the moment carries a quiet weight. To enter is to be acknowledged, to be seen. A second guard steps closer to you. His gaze meets yours briefly, not unkind, just direct. For a heartbeat, everything else seems to soften. The noise fades slightly. The movement slows. Then he gestures. It is a simple motion, one that needs no translation. You are allowed to pass. You step forward, crossing fully beyond the controlled space of the gate. Behind you, the process continues unchanged, steady as ever. Ahead, the city opens wider, its streets stretching into layers you have yet to explore. As you move away, you notice how quickly the atmosphere shifts. The tension, mild as it was, begins to dissolve. The sounds become less structured, more fluid. Conversations overlap more freely. Movement becomes less predictable. And yet the presence of the gate lingers in your mind. That quiet reminder that Babylon is not just a collection of buildings, but a system carefully maintained, quietly enforced. Scholars bicker over how centralized that control truly was. Was it strict and far-reaching, or did it rely more on local customs and shared expectations? As you walk deeper into the city, you begin to suspect the answer may lie somewhere in the spaces between rules and routines. The sunlight now reaches further into the streets, catching on dust that floats lazily in the air. A child runs past you, laughing momentarily, breaking the steady rhythm with something lighter, something unguarded. You watch them disappear into the crowd, and for a moment you feel it clearly. You are no longer at the edge. You are inside. The deeper you move, the more the city begins to unfold in layers that feel both intimate and overwhelming. The gate is already behind you, its order fading into memory, replaced by something looser, more alive. Here, the streets do not stretch in neat lines. They bend narrow, open, and close again, as though shaped not by a single plan, but by generations of footsteps, deciding where to go next. Your sandals press into the packed earth, and with each step, a faint puff of dust rises, catching the sunlight in soft, drifting clouds. It lingers in the air, settling gently on skin and fabric, becoming part of everything. You notice how no one seems bothered by it. It is simply the texture of life here. The street you follow is narrow enough that you could almost reach out and touch both sides if you tried. Walls rise close on either side, their surfaces uneven, patched in places where repairs have been made. A rough wooden door sits slightly ajar, and as you pass you catch a glimpse of shadow within, cool and still compared to the brightness outside. The sounds here are constant, but never quite overwhelming. Voices overlap in a steady hum, punctuated by sharper notes. A vendor calls out his tone, practiced, rising just enough to catch attention without becoming a shout. Nearby, the soft bleating of a goat threads through the noise, followed by the quick patter of small feet. The child moves past you, weaving easily through the crowd. Records confirm that Babylonian streets were often unpaved and irregular, shaped by daily use rather than strict urban planning, and you can feel that truth beneath your feet. The ground dips slightly in places worn by water or repeated passage, and you adjust your steps without thinking, learning the rhythm as you go. A woman passes you carrying a bundle of reeds, the dry stalks brushing lightly against your arm. The contact is brief, almost accidental, but it reminds you how close everything is here. Space is shared, negotiated moment by moment, without words. Oddly enough, some ancient texts suggest that waste disposal in cities like Babylon was less than ideal. You notice a faint, less pleasant scent drifting from a side alley, quickly masked by the stronger smells of cooking and animals. It is not overwhelming, just another layer in the sensory landscape, something accepted rather than avoided. You turn slightly as the street opens into a wider space, Not quite a square, but enough for people to gather more freely. Here the movement changes. Instead of a steady flow, there are clusters, small groups talking, exchanging goods, pausing in their journeys. A man crouches near the ground, arranging items on a cloth. Simple objects, tools perhaps, or small crafted pieces. His fingers move with care, placing each one deliberately. You watch for a moment, noticing the patience in the act. Nothing here feels rushed. Even work seems to carry its own quiet rhythm. No agreement has been reached on whether Babylon's street layout was ever formally planned or if it evolved entirely through organic growth. As you look around, it feels almost like a conversation between intention and improvisation. Some paths seem purposeful, leading clearly toward larger spaces. Others twist unexpectedly, inviting you to wander. A cart approaches from ahead, and you instinctively step to the side, pressing closer to the wall. The wooden wheels grind softly against the earth, and the animal pulling it snorts its breath, visible for a moment in the morning air. The driver nods briefly in your direction, a silent acknowledgement before continuing on. You notice how people communicate here with minimal effort. A glance, but a gesture, and a slight shift in direction. It is enough. There is an unspoken understanding that keeps everything moving, even in the tightest spaces. A curious footnote drifts through your thoughts. Some historians believe that certain streets may have been associated with specific trades, clustering similar activities together. You begin to wonder if the patterns you see are random or quietly organized beneath the surface. The light shifts as you walk, sometimes bright and direct, sometimes softened by the angle of the walls. In one stretch, a woven cloth has been stretched overhead between buildings, casting a patchwork of shade that cools the space beneath it. You step into it, feeling the temperature drop slightly, your skin grateful for the change. From somewhere nearby comes the rhythmic tapping of stone against stone. You follow the sound with your eyes and spot a figure seated low, working carefully with tools you cannot fully see. Each tap is precise, measured, almost meditative. Scholars bicker over how noisy ancient cities truly were. Some imagine a constant clamor, overwhelming and chaotic. Others suggest that the sounds blended into something more predictable, almost soothing in their repetition. Standing here, you sense it is not one or the other. It is a balance, a living rhythm that your mind begins to accept, even relax into. You pass another doorway, this one open, and inside you glimpse a small space where a woman kneels beside a low surface, her hands moving through a task you cannot quite identify. The interior is dim, the air cooler, and for a moment you feel the contrast between inside and outside as something deeply intentional. A retreat from the shared world of the street. The scent changes again as you continue. Something warm and inviting now. Perhaps bread baking or grain being prepared. It draws your attention not strongly, but enough to make you aware of hunger in a distant, almost abstract way. A young boy stands near the edge of the street, watching the movement with wide eyes. When he notices you looking, he tilts his head slightly, curious but unafraid. Then as quickly as the moment forms, it dissolves, and he turns back to whatever held his attention before. There is no single center to what you are experiencing, no clear beginning or end, just a continuous unfolding of small moments, each one blending into the next. And as you walk, adjusting to the dust, the closeness, the sounds and scents that weave together into something unmistakably alive. You begin to understand something simple and steady. This is not a city that reveals itself all at once. It is a place you learn by moving through it, step by quiet step. The street narrows again, guiding you almost gently toward a doorway that seems no different from the others at first glance. The wooden surface is worn, its edges softened by time and touch, and the threshold is marked by the faint hollow of countless feet stepping in and out. There is no grand sign, no decoration to announce what lies beyond, and yet something in you pauses here. For a moment, it feels as though the city itself is offering you a quieter path. You step inside. The shift is immediate. The brightness of the street fades behind you, replaced by a softer filtered light that settles into the space with calm intention. The air is cooler here, holding a faint scent of earth and something gently herbal, perhaps dried plants hanging somewhere out of sight. Your eyes adjust slowly, and the shape of the home begins to reveal itself. It is not large, at least not by any modern expectation, but it feels carefully arranged. A central courtyard opens before you, a small square of open sky framed by the surrounding rooms. Sunlight spills into this space, touching the packed ground and the simple objects arranged around it. Records confirm that many Babylonian homes were built around such courtyards, designed to provide light ventilation and a degree of privacy from the busy streets outside. Standing here, you can understand the quiet logic of it. The world beyond the walls feels distant, now softened into a background presence. You take a few slow steps forward, your hand brushing lightly against the inner wall. The surface is smoother than the exterior, perhaps replastered over time, cared for in small, consistent ways. It carries a faint coolness that contrasts with the warmth outside. To one side, a low doorway leads into a shaded room. You lean slightly to look inside, noticing woven mats laid across the floor and a few simple items arranged with care. There is no excess here. Everything has a place, and everything seems to serve a purpose. A curious footnote surfaces in your thoughts. Some households kept small altars or figurines within their homes, offering quiet prayers away from the larger temples. You glance around, wondering if such a space exists here, hidden in a corner or tucked into a niche. A faint sound draws your attention, the soft scrape of something against clay. You turn, and in the courtyard, a figure kneels beside a low vessel, hands moving steadily as they grind or mix something within it. The motion is rhythmic, almost soothing each movement, flowing into the next without interruption. Oddly enough, archaeologists have found that many daily tasks in ancient homes were performed at ground level, with people sitting or kneeling rather than standing. Watching this quiet activity, it feels natural, grounded, as though the body itself is part of the work. The figure does not seem startled by your presence. Perhaps in this imagined space, you are simply another passing awareness, unnoticed yet present. Or perhaps there is an understanding here that visitors come and go in ways that do not disturb the rhythm of daily life. You move along the edge of the courtyard, careful not to interrupt. The ground beneath your feet is firm, slightly uneven, shaped by years of use. In one corner you notice a clay jar, its surface marked with simple patterns. It rests in the shade, likely keeping its contents cooler. A council decree proves that storage of food and water was essential in Babylonian households, particularly in a climate where heat could quickly spoil supplies. The jar feels like a quiet guardian of daily survival. You pause beside it, noticing the faint scent rising from its opening. Water, perhaps, or grain. The smell is subtle, clean, reassuring in its simplicity. Above you, the open sky, framed by the courtyard, feels almost like a window into another world. A bird passes overhead, its shadow crossing briefly over the ground, a fleeting connection between inside and outside. No agreement has been reached on how much variation existed between homes of different social classes at this time. Some scholars suggest that wealthier families enjoyed larger courtyards and more elaborate interiors, while others argue that even modest homes shared similar structural principles. As you stand here, the space feels neither poor nor grand. It feels lived in. A woven cloth hangs along one wall, shifting slightly with the movement of air. You reach out, brushing your fingers against it. The texture is rough, but not unpleasant, carrying the faint warmth of sunlight it has absorbed. Another doorway reveals a second room, darker, cooler still. Inside, you can make out shapes that might be storage containers, tools, perhaps sleeping areas. The lack of clear separation between functions is striking. Life here does not divide itself into strict categories. It flows. One scandalous aside drifts into your thoughts. There are suggestions that some homes also served as places of small-scale trade or craft work, blurring the line between private and public life. You glance back toward the entrance, imagining how easily the space could shift depending on need. The person in the courtyard pauses for a moment, lifting their hands slightly, perhaps adjusting their grip, or resting briefly. Then the motion resumes steady as before. Time here does not seem to press forward. It settles. You become aware of the quiet in a new way. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of urgency. Outside, the city continues its restless movement, but here within these walls, everything feels contained, manageable. Scholars bicker over whether such domestic spaces were places of comfort or simply necessity shaped more by survival than by any notion of relaxation. Yet standing here, you sense something softer, a kind of balance, a place where the intensity of the outside world can be gently held at a distance. You take one last look around the courtyard, letting your eyes trace the lines of the walls, the simple objects, the small patch of sky above. It is not grand. It does not need to be. As you step back toward the doorway, the light shifts again, growing brighter, sharper, more insistent. The sounds of the street begin to return, filtering in slowly at first, then more clearly. And as you cross the threshold once more, you carry with you a quiet understanding that behind every wall in Babylon there is a space like this, hidden, ordered, alive in its own gentle way. The brightness of the street returns, but something in your pace has changed. After the quiet balance of the courtyard, the movement around you feels sharper, more defined, as though every gesture now carries a little more meaning. You walk more slowly, your attention drawn not just to what people do, but how they do it. A small group stands just ahead, gathered near a doorway. Their voices are low, not secretive, just measured. You notice the way one figure speaks, while the others listen, their bodies angled slightly inward, their expressions attentive. There is no interruption, no overlapping speech. The rhythm feels almost practiced. Records confirm that Babylonian society placed strong emphasis on hierarchy within both family and community life. And here, in this quiet exchange, you begin to see how that structure lives not in rules alone, but in behavior. in who speaks first, in who waits. You pass them gently, not wanting to disturb the moment, and your attention shifts to a nearby household where the doorway stands open. Inside, a family moves through their morning in a way that feels both ordinary and carefully ordered. An older figure sits near the entrance, their posture relaxed but observant, as though holding a position that requires no effort to maintain. A younger adult moves in and out of the courtyard space, carrying items, adjusting objects, tending to tasks that seem to flow one into another without pause. A child lingers nearby, watching occasionally, stepping forward to help, then retreating again, unsure of their role, but eager to be included. Oddly enough, in many ancient households, children learned not through formal instruction alone, but by observing and gradually participating in daily tasks. You can almost feel that process unfolding here, quiet and continuous. You lean slightly against the outer wall, careful to remain unnoticed and allow yourself to watch a little longer. The interactions are subtle. A glance from the elder shifts the movement of the younger. A brief word changes the direction of a task. Nothing is loud, nothing is forced, and yet everything responds. A council decree proves that family structure in Babylon was not just a private matter, but one recognized by law, with clear roles and expectations tied to inheritance, marriage, and responsibility. Even here in this simple scene, you sense that wider framework shaping what unfolds. A curious footnote drifts into your thoughts. Some Babylonian contracts included detailed agreements about family duties, even specifying how individuals were to care for aging parents. The idea feels both practical and deeply human, a reminder that these quiet relationships carried real weight. The child now attempts to lift a small object, perhaps heavier than expected. For a moment, there is a slight wobble, a hint of uncertainty. The younger adult steps closer, not intervening immediately, but watching ready. When the object tilts too far, they gently steady it, offering guidance without taking over. You notice how learning happens here, not through correction alone, but through presence. No agreement has been reached on how rigid these family roles truly were. Some scholars argue that daily life allowed for flexibility shaped by circumstance and personality. Others suggest that expectations were deeply ingrained, leaving little room for deviation. As you watch, it feels less like strict rules and more like a shared understanding quietly reinforced. The elder figure shifts slightly, their gaze moving across the space. For a brief moment, it passes over you, and although there is no sign of recognition, you feel the weight of it. Not judgment, not suspicion, simply awareness. You straighten subtly as though responding to something unspoken. A soft sound draws your attention to the side. Another doorway, partially closed, reveals a different scene. Two figures sit facing each other, their heads inclined as they speak. The tone is lower, more private. Their hands move occasionally, emphasizing a point, but the conversation remains contained. One scandalous aside lingers in your thoughts. There are hints in ancient texts that family disputes could sometimes become formal matters brought before officials if they could not be resolved privately. You glance at the two figures, wondering what words are being exchanged, what tensions might exist beneath the calm surface. Scholars bicker over how common such disputes were. Were they rare disruptions in otherwise stable households, or a more frequent reality hidden behind closed doors? The truth, like so much here, seems to rest somewhere in between. A faint breeze moves through the street, carrying with it the scent of something cooking nearby. It brushes past you, soft and fleeting, and you notice how the people around you barely react. They are accustomed to these subtle shifts, these passing signals of life unfolding in every direction. The child from earlier now laughs quietly, the sound small but bright. It breaks through the steady rhythm for just a moment, adding something lighter, something unguarded. The elder figure's expression softens almost imperceptibly and then returns to its calm state. You begin to understand that hierarchy here is not only about authority, it is also about care, about continuity, about ensuring that each person knows their place, not as a limitation, but as part of a larger pattern. A young woman steps out from another doorway, adjusting a piece of cloth draped over her shoulder. Her movements are practiced efficient, and she carries herself with a quiet confidence. As she passes, another figure nods to her, a brief acknowledgement that seems to carry more meaning than words. You follow her with your eyes for a moment, noticing how she moves through the space without hesitation, as though the streets themselves are familiar companions. In your ears, the echo of the city shifts again, blending voices, footsteps, and distant sounds into something almost steady enough to feel like a backdrop rather than a distraction. And as you continue walking, leaving these small scenes behind you, carry with you a growing awareness that life in Babylon is not only shaped by walls and markets and temples, it is shaped quietly and constantly by the relationships that unfold within them. The street bends again, and with it your attention shifts from people to something more subtle, something that seems to move beneath the surface of everything you have seen so far. You begin to notice how often hands carry jars, how frequently footsteps lead toward certain corners, how the faint scent of damp clay appears and disappears like a quiet signal. Water. It is not always visible, but it is always present. You follow the pattern without quite deciding to your steps, guided by the gentle logic of the city. The sounds begin to change as well. The steady murmur of voices is joined by something softer, more fluid, a faint trickle, the hollow echo of liquid poured into a container. Ahead, a small gathering forms around a well. It is not crowded, but there is a steady flow of people arriving, waiting, leaving. The structure itself is simple, its edge worn smooth by years of use. A rope hangs over the opening, darkened in places where countless hands have gripped it. You move closer, careful not to disrupt the rhythm. A woman lowers a vessel slowly, her movements controlled, practiced. The rope slides against the edge with a soft, familiar sound. When she draws it back up, the weight is evident, but so is her familiarity with the task. Records confirm that access to water in Babylon relied heavily on the Euphrates River and systems of wells and canals, making it one of the most critical aspects of daily survival. Standing here, you feel that importance in a way that is immediate and undeniable. The vessel is lifted, water shimmering briefly in the morning light before settling. She pours a small amount into another container, then secures the rest, adjusting the balance with quiet precision. You notice how no one rushes her. There is patience here, a shared understanding that this task cannot be hurried without consequence. Oddly enough, some ancient accounts suggest that water quality could vary greatly depending on location and season. You glance into the well, wondering about its depth, its source, the unseen pathways that bring water to this point. A young boy steps forward next, gripping the rope with both hands. His movements are less certain, the rhythm not yet fully learned. An older figure stands nearby, watching closely, offering guidance with a few quiet words. The rope slips slightly, and the boy adjusts his expression, tightening for a moment before settling again. When the vessel finally rises, he looks almost surprised, as though the success was not entirely expected. You feel a small sense of shared relief. A council decree proves that irrigation and water management were central concerns for Babylonian authorities, with laws governing the maintenance of canals and the responsibilities of those who depended on them. Even this simple well is part of a much larger system, one that stretches beyond what you can see. A faint breeze moves through the space, carrying the cool scent of water mixed with the warmth of the surrounding earth. It brushes against your skin, a subtle contrast that feels almost refreshing. Nearby, a narrow channel runs along the edge of the street, its shallow flow barely noticeable at first. You step closer, watching as the water moves slowly, guided by the slight incline of the ground. It is not fast, not dramatic, but steady. A curious footnote drifts through your thoughts. Some canals in ancient Mesopotamia were so carefully constructed that they could direct water across long distances, supporting agriculture far beyond the riverbanks. You imagine those unseen networks stretching outward like veins from the heart of the city. No agreement has been reached on how efficiently these systems were maintained over time. Some scholars suggest periods of careful management and prosperity, while others point to neglect and flooding when systems failed. As you watch the gentle flow before you, it is easy to forget how fragile that balance might be. A man approaches with two large jars suspended from a pole across his shoulders. The weight is evident in the way he leans slightly forward, his steps measured. He pauses near the well, setting the jars down with a soft thud that sends a faint vibration through the ground. He wipes his brow briefly, then begins the process again, lowering, lifting, pouring. Each movement part of a cycle that repeats day after day. You notice the marks on the jars, small variations in shape and texture that hint at different makers, different moments of creation. Even in something as practical as water storage, there is individuality. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that disputes over water rights could become serious, even leading to legal action. In a place where water means life, control over it carries quiet power. Scholars bicker over how often such conflicts occurred. Were they rare, resolved quickly through established rules, or more frequent tensions simmering beneath the surface? The answer, like the water itself, seems to move just out of clear view. A woman nearby dips her fingers into a small bowl, lifting a few drops to her face. She closes her eyes briefly, the gesture simple but deeply felt. It is not just about necessity. It is about relief, about connection. You feel the urge to do the same, to reach out and touch the surface, to feel the coolness against your skin. Even imagining it brings a sense of calm. The sounds around you settle into a gentle rhythm. The creak of rope, the soft splash of water, the quiet exchange of voices. It is almost hypnotic, a pattern that could easily draw you into stillness if you let it. And perhaps that is part of its purpose, not just to sustain the body, but to anchor the day, to provide a moment where movement slows, where attention narrows, where the essential nature of life becomes clear. As you step back from the well, allowing others to move forward, you carry with you a new awareness that beneath the dust, beneath the noise, beneath the shifting patterns of the city, there is something constant, flowing, essential. quietly holding everything together. The quiet rhythm of the well lingers in your senses as you move on, but the air begins to shift again, growing richer, fuller layered with scents that seem to gather before you even see their source. Something warm, something spiced, something faintly sweet drifts toward you, and without quite deciding to you follow it. The street widens gradually, and the movement changes with it. The steady flow of footsteps becomes more scattered, more animated. Voices rise and fall with greater energy, overlapping in a way that feels less restrained, more expressive. You can sense it before you fully arrive. This is where people come not just to pass through, but to pause, to exchange, to linger. The marketplace. It does not announce itself with a single boundary. Instead, it reveals itself in clusters. A group gathered around woven textiles, another near baskets of produce, a third where metal tools catch the light with quiet flashes. Each cluster hums with its own small rhythm, yet all of them blend into something larger. Records confirm that markets were central to Babylonian urban life, serving as hubs for trade communication and social interaction. Standing at the edge of it, you feel that importance immediately, not as an abstract idea, but as something alive and unfolding in front of you. You step closer. A vendor spreads out lengths of cloth, their colors muted by time but still varied. Soft earth tones, faded reds, hints of blue. The fabric moves slightly in the breeze, catching light in different ways. You reach out, brushing your fingers across one edge. It is rougher than you expect, but strong. The vendor notices your touch and gestures lightly, his expression open, inviting. There is no pressure, just an offering. Nearby, another stall displays small containers filled with powders and dried plants. The scent here is stronger, sharper, something bitter, something fragrant. You inhale gently, trying to separate the layers, but they blend together in a way that feels almost intentional. A curious footnote surfaces. Some spices and goods traded in Babylon traveled vast distances, passing through many hands before arriving here. You imagine the journey behind each item, the unseen paths connecting this place to lands far beyond your view. A woman kneels beside a basket of dates, sorting them with careful attention. Her fingers move quickly, selecting, arranging, occasionally setting one aside. The fruit catches the light, its surface slightly glossy, promising sweetness. Oddly enough, dates were not just a common food, but a vital part of the Babylonian diet, used in everything from simple meals to fermented drinks. You remember the faint sweetness in the air earlier and realize you are standing at its source. The sounds here rise and fall like a tide. A voice calls out a price. Another responds lower, measured. There is a brief pause, then a soft laugh. Negotiation, but without hostility. A kind of dance. A council decree proves that trade in Babylon was often regulated with certain goods subject to oversight and standard measures. Yet here in this moment, the process feels personal, shaped by interaction as much as by rule. You move further in your shoulders, brushing lightly against others as the space narrows between stalls. No one seems to mind. There is an understanding that closeness is part of the experience. A man holds up a small metal tool, turning it slightly so it catches the light. He speaks quietly to a potential buyer, his tone calm, confident. The buyer listens, nods, then gestures in response. Their hands move, indicating amounts, possibilities, limits. No agreement has been reached on how standardized pricing truly was in markets like this. Some scholars suggest fixed values guided by authority, while others argue that bargaining played a significant role. Watching this exchange, it feels clear that both ideas might exist together, overlapping like everything else here. A faint breeze carries the scent of cooked grain from somewhere deeper in the market. It mixes with the sharper notes of spices and the earthy smell of raw materials. The combination is complex, but not unpleasant. It feels full, alive. One scandalous aside drifts into your thoughts. There are hints that some merchants may have adjusted weights or measures to their advantage, a quiet manipulation hidden within the act of trade. You glance at the tools and containers around you, wondering how trust is built and how easily it might be tested. Scholars bicker over how often such practices occurred. Were they rare exceptions or a common undercurrent beneath the surface of honest exchange? The answer seems to flicker in the small pauses between words, in the careful watching of hands. A child darts between two stalls, laughing softly, chased by another just behind. Their movement is quick light, weaving through the crowd with ease. For a moment, the marketplace feels less like a place of transaction and more like a shared space of life. You pause near a stall where pottery is arranged in neat rows. Each piece carries slight variations, small marks of the hand that shaped it. You lift one gently, feeling its weight, its balance. It is simple, but there is a quiet beauty in its form. The vendor watches you, not speaking, simply observing. There is patience here, an understanding that decisions take time. In your ears, the layered sounds begin to settle into something almost rhythmic again. Not the steady calm of the well, but a more complex pattern. Voices rising, falling, movement shifting, adjusting. It is busy, but not overwhelming, not if you let it be. You set the pottery back carefully, aligning it with the others, and step away. The marketplace continues around you, unchanged by your brief presence, yet somehow more familiar now. As you move toward the edge, the density begins to thin. The sounds soften slightly. The scents fade into the background. And as you leave it behind, you carry with you the sense that this place is more than a center of trade. It is a meeting point of goods, of people, of stories quietly exchanged beneath the surface of every transaction. The hum of the marketplace softens behind you, but it does not disappear entirely. Instead, it lingers like a distant echo woven into the air as you follow a quieter path where the scent of food begins to grow warmer, more grounded, more inviting. It reaches you before you see it. A soft, steady aroma of grain, heated and transformed, carrying a comfort that feels almost universal. Your steps slow without effort, drawn toward it with quiet curiosity. Ahead, a small cluster of people gathers near a low structure, where a flat surface rests over a source of heat. The glow is subtle, but you can feel it as you approach, a gentle warmth brushing against your skin. Bread. It is simple, and yet here it feels essential. A woman stands near the heat, her hands moving with practiced ease. She shapes a piece of dough, flattening it between her palms, then placing it carefully onto the hot surface. There is a soft sound. It meets the heat, followed by the faintest shift in scent as the grain begins to change. Records confirm that bread was a staple of the Babylonian diet, made primarily from barley and sometimes wheat, forming the foundation of daily meals. Watching this quiet process, you begin to understand how something so basic can hold such importance. You step a little closer, feeling the warmth more clearly now. The air here is different from the market, less layered, more focused. Grain, heat a hint of smoke rising gently and disappearing into the morning. A curious footnote drifts through your thoughts. Some ancient breads were not leavened in the way you might expect, resulting in flatter, denser textures that could be easily carried or stored. You imagine the feel of it in your hands, the weight, the firmness. The woman turns the bread with a small, controlled motion, her fingers moving quickly enough to avoid the heat. There is no hesitation. This is a motion repeated countless times, refined until it becomes almost effortless. Nearby, a man sits on a low surface breaking a piece of bread into smaller portions. He hands one to a child beside him, who takes it with both hands, as though receiving something of quiet value. Oddly enough, meals in ancient Babylon were often simple, built around bread grains, and whatever could be added depending on season and circumstance. There is no excess here, but there is enough. You watch as the child takes a small bite, their expression unchanged but focused. Eating here is not rushed. It is steady, intentional. A council decree proves that rations of grain were sometimes distributed as payment, particularly for workers making bread, not just food, but a form of economic exchange. The idea lingers as you observe adding another layer to what might otherwise seem like a simple act. A small bowl is passed between two figures, containing something thicker, perhaps a porridge or stew. One dips a piece of bread into it, lifting it carefully before eating. The motion is slow, almost deliberate, as though each step carries its own rhythm. The scent deepens as more bread is placed onto the heat. You notice how it changes subtly over time, raw grain giving way to something richer, more complex. It is a transformation that feels both ordinary and quietly remarkable. No agreement has been reached on the exact variety of foods available to different classes within Babylon. Some scholars suggest that wealthier households enjoyed more diverse ingredients, while others argue that the basic structure of meals remained similar across much of society. As you stand here, the simplicity feels shared. A faint crackle comes from the cooking surface, followed by the soft shifting of the bread as it is moved again. The sound blends with the low murmur of conversation, creating a background that feels almost soothing. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that some bakers might have mixed lower-quality grain into their products to stretch supplies, a quiet compromise hidden within necessity. You glance at the bread again, wondering how often such decisions were made. Scholars bicker over how common such practices were. Were they rare, driven by desperation, or a more regular adjustment in a world where resources could fluctuate? The answer feels as elusive as the exact balance of ingredients in the bread before you. A woman nearby pours a small amount of liquid into a cup, handing it to another figure. The gesture is simple, but it carries a sense of sharing, of connection. Food here is not just sustenance, it is interaction. You notice how people sit close to one another, their movements overlapping slightly, their space shared without tension. There is an ease in it, a quiet acceptance of proximity. The child from earlier finishes their portion and looks toward the cooking surface waiting. There is no impatience, only expectation. The rhythm of the process is understood. You feel a subtle pull to remain here, to let the warmth and scent settle into your senses. It is not dramatic, not overwhelming, but deeply grounding. And perhaps that is the point. In a city filled with movement, with trade, with structure and hierarchy, moments like this offer something steady, something reliable. As you step back, allowing others to move closer, you carry with you the quiet understanding that this simple act shaping grain and heat into something nourishing is one of the threads holding everything together. A small, warm center in the vast, shifting life of Babylon. The warmth of the cooking fire lingers with you as you move away, but now another scent begins to weave itself into the air, sweeter, richer, almost syrupy. It rises gently, blending with the dry notes of dust and grain, and it pulls your attention in a different direction. For a moment, it feels as though the city itself is offering you a small indulgence. You follow the scent, and soon find yourself near a quieter gathering, less crowded than the marketplace, more relaxed in its rhythm. Here people are not rushing to trade or complete tasks. They are pausing, resting, letting the day settle into something slower. A low table sits at the center of the space, surrounded by a few figures seated on woven mats. In front of them are small vessels, cups shaped from clay, their surfaces slightly uneven but carefully made. Beer. It might not look like what you expect. The liquid is thicker, cloudier, and served in a way that feels more communal than individual. A long reed rests in one of the containers, its hollow stem used for drinking, without disturbing the sediment below. Records confirm that beer was a daily staple in Babylonian life, often safer to drink than untreated water, and consumed by people of all social levels. You watch as one of the seated figures lifts the reed to their lips, drawing slowly, their posture relaxed. A curious footnote drifts through your thoughts. Some ancient depictions show multiple people drinking from the same vessel using separate reeds, a quiet image of shared experience rather than private consumption. You glance at the group, imagining how common such moments must have been. The scent here is unmistakable now. Fermented grain, slightly sour, slightly sweet. It carries a depth that feels both grounding and faintly celebratory. Oddly enough, beer in ancient Mesopotamia was often flavored with dates or other natural ingredients, adding layers of taste that varied from batch to batch. You notice a small bowl nearby, filled with dates, their dark skins catching the light, their presence both decorative and practical. One of the figures picks up a date, turning it briefly between their fingers before taking a bite. The motion is unhurried, almost reflective, sweetness balanced by the weight of the day. You step a little closer, careful not to intrude, and listen to the soft murmur of conversation. The tone is different from the market, less transactional, more open. There are pauses here, moments where no one speaks, and yet the silence feels full rather than empty. A council decree proves that rations of beer were sometimes distributed alongside grain, particularly for laborers, making it both nourishment and reward. The idea settles into your thoughts as you watch the group adding another layer to what you are seeing. One man leans back slightly, resting his weight on one hand, his other hand loosely holding a cup. His expression is calm, his gaze unfocused, as though his thoughts have drifted somewhere just beyond the present moment. No agreement has been reached on how strong Babylonian beer truly was. Some scholars suggest it was relatively mild, consumed throughout the day without great effect. Others argue that certain varieties could be quite potent, especially when prepared with care. As you observe, it feels less like a question of strength and more like a question of rhythm. This is not about excess. It is about pacing. A faint breeze moves through the space, carrying the scent of dates and fermented grain across your senses. It brushes lightly against your skin, soft and almost cooling. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are hints in ancient texts that taverns often run by women could be places of both social gathering and occasional disorder where rules blurred and behavior shifted. You glance around, but here everything feels calm, balanced, held within quiet limits. Scholars bicker over the role of such spaces. Were they simple places of rest, or did they carry deeper social significance, acting as centers of connection and exchange? The answer seems to rest in the gentle interactions unfolding before you. A woman refills one of the vessels, pouring carefully to avoid disturbing the contents too much. Her movements are steady, practiced, and there is a quiet pride in the way she handles the task. You notice how people here are not focused on you or on anything beyond their immediate circle. Their attention is inward, shared among themselves, creating a small world within the larger city. A child sits nearby, not drinking, but watching, occasionally reaching for a piece of food. There is no sense of exclusion, only a quiet understanding of roles. The light shifts slightly as the sun climbs higher, casting softer shadows across the space. The day is moving forward, but here time seems to stretch. You feel it in your own breathing, which has slowed without you noticing. The steady rhythm of the city fades into the background, replaced by something more contained, more personal. In your ears the sounds soften again, a low voice, the gentle tap of a cup being set down, the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifts their position. You realize that these small moments, these pauses in the flow of work and movement, are just as essential as anything else you have seen. They offer balance, relief, a chance to exist without urgency, even if only for a little while. As you step back, letting the scene continue without you, you carry with you the sense that Babylon is not only built on labor and structure, it is also built on these quiet indulgences, sweet, shared, and gently woven into the fabric of daily life. The sweetness of dates and the slow comfort of shared drink fade behind you, replaced once again by the steady pulse of work. It comes to you first as sound, a sharper rhythm now, repeated, focused, the kind of sound that belongs to hands, shaping something, refining it, turning raw material into something purposeful. You follow it almost without thinking. The street narrows slightly, but not in the same way as before. Here, the closeness feels different, intentional. The walls are marked in places, stained or worn in patterns that suggest repeated activity. This is not just a place people pass through. This is a place where things are made. Ahead, a figure sits low beside a spinning wheel. Clay rests at its center, rising slowly as hands guide it upward. The motion is smooth, continuous, almost hypnotic. The wheel hums softly as it turns, and the shape begins to take form, widening, narrowing, settling into balance. You pause, watching. Records confirm that Babylonian craftsmen were highly skilled in pottery, metalwork, and textiles, producing goods that supported both local life and long-distance trade. As you observe the steady hands before you, the truth of that skill becomes quietly undeniable. The clay glistens faintly with moisture, catching the light in small, shifting reflections. The potter's fingers press gently, then release, then press again, each movement shaping not just the object, but the space around it. A curious footnote drifts into your thoughts. Some ancient pottery was stamped or marked with symbols, possibly indicating the maker or the workshop. You glance at the finished pieces nearby, wondering which hands shaped which forms. The potter pauses briefly, dipping fingers into a small bowl of water before returning them to the spinning clay. The rhythm resumes without interruption, as though the pause was simply part of the motion itself. Nearby, another figure works with metal. The sound is sharper here. A controlled strike followed by a pause, then another. The material responds with a faint ring, its shape gradually changing under repeated effort. Oddly enough, metal workers in Babylon often relied on bronze and alloy that required both skill and careful control of temperature. You watch as the figure adjusts their grip, their posture steady, their focus unwavering. The air here carries a different scent, earth and heat from the pottery, a faint tang of metal, a trace of smoke that lingers just long enough to be noticed. You move a little further in noticing how each space seems dedicated to a particular task. One area for shaping clay, another for weaving fibers, a third where tools are laid out in careful order ready for use. A council decree proves that certain crafts were organized and sometimes regulated, particularly when they were tied to temple production or large-scale trade. This is not random activity. It is part of a broader system, and yet it feels personal. Each craftsperson moves with their own rhythm, their own pace. There is no single tempo here, only a shared understanding of purpose. No agreement has been reached on how strictly these crafts were divided into guilds or formal groups. Some scholars argue for organized systems of apprenticeship and control, while others suggest a more flexible structure based on family and proximity. As you watch, it feels like both ideas might exist together. A young apprentice stands nearby, observing the potter. Their posture mirrors the master's, slightly as though learning not just the technique, but the stance, the presence. Occasionally they reach out, adjusting a tool, assisting in small ways. You notice how knowledge passes here, not through instruction alone, but through watching, repeating, refining. One scandalous aside lingers in your thoughts. There are hints that some craftsmen guarded their techniques closely, sharing them only within trusted circles to maintain their advantage. You glance at the careful movements, the subtle adjustments, and it feels plausible. Scholars bicker over how open or secretive such knowledge truly was. Was it widely shared for the benefit of the community or protected as a source of status and income? The answer seems to rest in the quiet spaces between observation and imitation. A woven cloth hangs nearby, its threads forming a pattern that shifts slightly as it moves in the air. You reach out, brushing it lightly. The texture is tighter than the one you felt earlier, more refined, suggesting a different level of skill, or perhaps a different purpose. The weaver sits just beyond their hands, moving quickly, guiding thread through thread in a pattern that feels almost too fast to follow. And yet there is no rush, only precision. You notice how the sounds of each craft overlap. The hum of the wheel, the ring of metal, the soft pull of thread. Together they form a kind of quiet music, a rhythm that belongs to creation itself. In your ears, it settles into something steady, something almost soothing. You realize that everything you have seen so far, the bread, the jars, the tools, the cloth, all of it begins in places like this. In small, focused spaces where hands repeat the same motions until they become something more than effort. They become skill. They become identity. As you step back, allowing the work to continue without interruption, you carry with you a deeper sense of how Babylon functions, not just through grand systems or visible structures, but through these quiet acts of making. Repeated, refined, and woven into every corner of the city's life. The rhythm of craft fades gradually behind you, but it does not disappear entirely. It settles somewhere in your awareness like a steady pulse beneath everything else. As you walk, the streets begin to shift again, widening slightly, then narrowing, then opening in ways that feel less dense, less enclosed. Your thoughts drift outward, beyond these walls, beyond the steady hum of the city. For a moment, it feels as though your senses stretch past the buildings, past the movement of people, following an invisible thread that leads toward something quieter, more expansive. The land that feeds all of this. You pause near an opening, where the city wall stands at a distance, visible through a break in the structures. It is not a gate, not a formal exit, just a place where your line of sight extends further than usual. Through it, you glimpse a different world. Flatland stretching under the same sun. Fields. Records confirm that Babylon depended heavily on agriculture sustained by the Euphrates River, with farmers cultivating barley, dates, and other crops that supported the dense urban population. As you stand here, the connection feels immediate, undeniable. You cannot see every detail, but you can imagine it clearly enough. Rows of crops bending slightly in the breeze, the steady motion of workers moving through them, the slow, patient cycle of planting and harvesting that exists far from the noise of the streets. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some farmers in ancient Mesopotamia worked land that was not entirely their own, bound by agreements or obligations to those who controlled larger estates. You consider what that might feel like to labor daily on soil that feeds a city you rarely enter. The air here carries a different scent, fainter, less layered. There is still dust, still warmth, but also something open, something less confined. Oddly enough, many city dwellers in Babylon may have had only occasional contact with the fields that sustained them, relying instead on systems of distribution to bring food inward. The distance between production and consumption feels both small and vast at the same time. You watch as a figure moves along the edge of the visible land, their form small against the open space. Their pace is steady, unhurried, much like everything else you have seen, but there is a difference here. The rhythm belongs to the land rather than the crowd. A council decree proves that irrigation systems required constant maintenance, with responsibilities assigned to individuals to ensure canals remained functional. Without that effort, the fields would falter, and with them, the city itself. You imagine the channels of water stretching outward, branching like veins across the land, carrying life from the river into soil that would otherwise remain dry. The same water you saw drawn from the well, now moving through a different part of its journey. No agreement has been reached on how stable these agricultural systems were over long periods. Some scholars point to cycles of abundance and decline, shaped by climate management and shifting control. As you stand here, the fields seem calm, but you sense the fragility beneath that calm. A faint breeze carries with it the scent of earth dry, but not lifeless. It brushes against your face softer than the air within the city, as though it has more space to move. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that disputes over land and water could escalate into larger conflicts, shaping not just individual lives, but entire regions. You look out again, imagining how something as simple as a canal could become a point of tension. Scholars bicker over how often such tensions disrupted daily life. Were they distant concerns rarely felt within the city, or constant pressures shaping decisions at every level? The answer feels as distant as the horizon itself. You turn slightly, looking back toward the streets behind you. The buildings rise again, enclosing the space, drawing you back into the layered life you have been moving through. The contrast is striking. Inside density, movement, interaction; outside openness, repetition, quiet labor. And yet they are not separate. They are part of the same cycle. A cart passes near you, loaded with what appears to be sacks of grain. The driver moves steadily, guiding the animal without urgency. The contents shift slightly with each step, a reminder that what you saw in the distance is already making its way inward. You follow the cart with your eyes as it disappears deeper into the city, merging with the flow of daily life. In your ears, the sounds begin to rise again. Voices, footsteps, the layered rhythm returning, pulling you gently back into its pattern. But something has changed. You now carry a sense of what lies beyond the walls of the quiet effort that supports everything you see. And as you turn fully away from the open view, stepping once more into the narrow living streets, you understand something simple and steady. That Babylon is not only built by those within it, it is sustained by those beyond it, working, waiting, and quietly shaping the life of the city with every passing season. As you move away from the distant glimpse of fields, the city closes around you again, its walls and pathways drawing you back into the intricate web of daily life. The openness fades, replaced by closeness, by layers of presence that feel more immediate, more personal. And yet something in your awareness has shifted. You begin to notice not just what people are doing, but how their roles differ. Subtly, at first, a difference in posture, in clothing, in how others respond to them. A man walks past you carrying a heavy load, his shoulders angled forward, his steps steady but deliberate. No one stops him, no one speaks to him, and yet his presence is acknowledged in the way others make space, just enough not out of respect, but out of recognition. Behind him another figure follows, empty-handed, but walking closely watchful. There is a connection there, quiet but clear. Records confirm that Babylonian society included various levels of status, including free citizens, dependent workers, and enslaved individuals, each with distinct roles and limitations. As you observe, these distinctions are not loudly declared. They are lived. You slow your pace, allowing yourself to take in the details. A household doorway opens nearby, and a figure steps out carrying a vessel. Their clothing is simple, worn in a way that suggests repeated use. They move quickly, efficiently, not pausing to look around. Inside the doorway, you glimpse another figure seated, their posture relaxed, their hands still. The contrast is subtle, but it lingers. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. In some cases, enslaved individuals in Babylon could own property or earn money, a complexity that blurs the lines between strict categories. You consider what that might feel like, to exist within a system that defines you, yet still allows small spaces of agency. The air here feels slightly heavier, though the scents remain familiar. Dust, warm clay, a faint trace of cooking carried from somewhere unseen. Oddly enough, some laborers were not enslaved, but bound by debt, working to repay obligations over time. The distinction is not always visible from the outside, and as you watch the movement around you, you realize how easily one might assume what cannot be known at a glance. A council decree proves that laws in Babylon address the treatment and responsibilities of both servants and masters, outlining rights and punishments in ways that reflect a structured, if unequal, society. Even here in these passing moments, that structure is present. A woman stands near a doorway, speaking quietly to another. Their voices are low, their gestures controlled. One nods, then turns stepping inside, while the other remains, her gaze following for a moment before returning to the street. You notice how interactions shift, depending on who is involved. Some exchanges are brief, almost transitional. Others carry a softer tone, a familiarity that suggests longer connection. No agreement has been reached on how rigid these social divisions were in daily life. Some scholars argue that boundaries were strictly enforced, while others suggest that relationships could be more fluid, shaped by circumstance and necessity. As you walk, it feels as though both possibilities exist at once. A young figure hurries past you carrying a bundle of cloth. Their steps are quick, their focus forward, as though driven by instruction or expectation. Behind them, an older individual calls out not sharply, but with enough weight to alter the pace. The younger slows, turns slightly, listens. There is no visible conflict, only adjustment. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are records suggesting that some enslaved individuals could eventually gain their freedom, though the process was uncertain and not guaranteed. You glance at the people around you, wondering how many carry that possibility quietly within their lives. Scholars bicker over how common such transitions were. Were they rare exceptions, or part of a broader, if limited, pathway within the system? The truth seems to rest somewhere beyond what can be easily observed. A cart rolls by its wheels, pressing into the earth with a steady weight. The driver guides it with practiced ease, while another figure walks alongside, adjusting the load as needed. Their movements are coordinated, unspoken, shaped by repetition. You notice how work often happens in pairs or small groups, each person fulfilling a role that complements the others. There is efficiency here, but also dependence. The light shifts slightly as the sun continues its climb, casting stronger shadows along the walls. The heat begins to settle more firmly against your skin, not uncomfortable but present. In your ears, the sounds of the city remain layered, but you begin to distinguish new tones. A sharper command here, a softer reply there. The subtle differences in how voices carry depending on who is speaking. You realize that hierarchy here is not only seen, it is heard and felt. You pass another household where activity spills just slightly into the street. A figure kneels, scrubbing a surface with steady, repetitive motion, while another stands nearby, observing. The relationship is clear, though nothing is said. A faint breeze moves through, lifting the edge of a hanging cloth. It reveals just for a moment a glimpse of the interior beyond, then falls back into place, closing the view again. You continue walking, your pace unhurried, your awareness wider now. The city feels more complex than it did before, not just in its structures or its sounds, but in the invisible lines that shape how people move, how they speak, how they exist alongside one another. And as you move deeper into that complexity, you begin to understand something that does not announce itself, but is always there. That beneath the shared rhythms of daily life, there are quieter currents of power, of limitation, of possibility, flowing just beneath the surface. The subtle weight of those unseen boundaries stays with you as you walk, but soon your attention begins to lift, drawn upward by something that rises above the low lines of homes and workshops. At first, it is only a shift in light, a brightness that catches at the edge of your vision. Then slowly, the structure reveals itself. A temple, it stands taller than anything around it, its walls more defined, its presence more deliberate. Even before you reach it, the space begins to change. The streets widen slightly, the movement of people grows more purposeful, and the sounds, though still present, seem to soften at the edges. For a moment, it feels as though the city itself is making room. You approach without hurry, your steps slowing as the details come into focus. The surface of the temple walls is smoother than the surrounding buildings, the lines more carefully maintained. There is a sense of care here, of attention that goes beyond simple function. Records confirm that temples in Babylon were not only places of worship, but also centers of economic and administrative activity, managing land, labor, and resources. As you stand before it, that dual role feels tangible, though not immediately visible. The entrance is open but not casual. There is a quiet threshold, not marked by barriers, but by a shift in atmosphere. People who pass through it do so with a slight change in posture, a subtle awareness that this space carries different expectations. You follow, stepping across. Inside, the air cools slightly, and the scent changes. Incense lingers here, faint but persistent, weaving through the space in delicate threads. It is not overpowering. It is present in a way that feels intentional, as though meant to shape the experience of being here. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some temples maintained specific blends of incense chosen for their symbolic or sensory qualities, creating an environment that engaged more than just sight and sound. You breathe in gently, letting the scent settle. The interior is not crowded, but it is not empty either. Figures move with quiet purpose, their steps measured, their voices low. There is a rhythm here, but it is different from the streets, slower, more deliberate. Oddly enough, temples often functioned as places where offerings were made not only by the wealthy, but by ordinary people as well, each bringing what they could. You notice a small arrangement near one wall. Simple items placed carefully, their significance resting not in their size, but in the act of giving. A council decree proves that temples held significant influence in Babylonian society, sometimes controlling large areas of land and employing many workers. The scale of that influence is not immediately visible, but you can feel its presence in the way people move, in the quiet respect that fills the space. You walk along the interior, your fingers brushing lightly against the wall. It is cool, smoother than the exterior surfaces you have touched before, as though maintained with care over time. Ahead, a figure stands near a raised area, their clothing slightly different from those around them. Not elaborate, but distinct. Their posture is upright, their movements precise. A priest. You watch as they perform a small action, perhaps placing an object, perhaps adjusting something unseen from your angle. The motion is careful, almost ritualized, each step carrying a weight that feels both practiced and meaningful. No agreement has been reached on how much of temple ritual was visible to the general public versus reserved for specific individuals. Some scholars suggest that many ceremonies were private, while others argue that communal participation played a larger role. As you observe, it feels as though you are witnessing only a portion of something larger. A faint sound reaches your ears, not quite music, but patterned, a sequence of tones or words spoken in a steady cadence. It is soft enough that you cannot fully make it out, but clear enough to recognize its structure. You pause, letting the sound settle around you. One scandalous aside lingers in your thoughts. There are suggestions that temples could accumulate significant wealth, leading to tensions between religious and political authorities. You glance around, wondering how much of that dynamic is present here, hidden beneath the calm surface. Scholars bicker over the balance of power between temple and state. Were temples dominant forces shaping policy and economy, or were they ultimately controlled by kings and officials? The answer seems to shift depending on time and place, just as the city itself does. A small group enters behind you, their steps quiet, their expressions composed. One carries a small object, holding it carefully as they approach the inner space. When they reach a certain point, they pause, bowing their head slightly before moving forward again. The gesture is subtle, but it carries meaning. You notice how the space encourages a kind of stillness, not silence exactly, but a reduction. Movements become smaller, voices lower, even your own breathing feels more measured. The light here is softer, filtered through openings that allow it to enter without overwhelming the space. It falls across the floor in gentle patterns, shifting slowly as the sun continues its path. You become aware of your own presence in a new way, not as a passerby, but as something quieter, something observing without needing to act. And in that stillness, you begin to understand something that the city outside does not always reveal so clearly. That beyond trade, beyond labor, beyond the structures of daily life, there is another layer, one that seeks meaning, connection, a sense of order that extends beyond what can be seen or touched. As you step back, preparing to leave the temple space, the scent of incense follows you briefly, then fades as you cross the threshold once more. The sounds of the city return gently at first, then more fully. But something of that quiet remains, a subtle echo, carried with you as you continue. The quiet presence of the temple lingers with you as you step back into the sunlit streets, but it does not disappear. Instead, it settles into your awareness like a soft echo that reshapes how you notice what comes next. You do not go far before you sense that the temple is not just a place you visited. It is something that continues outward. A figure in similar attire to the one you observed inside moves along the street ahead of you, their pace steady, their gaze focused. Their clothing is simple yet distinct enough to mark their role. People around them shift slightly as they pass, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge their presence. A priest carrying the quiet authority of the sacred beyond the temple walls. Records confirm that priests in Babylon were not only responsible for rituals, but also played roles in administration, record-keeping, and interpretation of omens. As you follow at a respectful distance, you begin to see how that influence extends into daily life. The priest pauses near a doorway where a small group has gathered. Their voices lower further as the priest approaches, and for a moment the flow of conversation adjusts, reshaping itself around this presence. You cannot hear the words clearly, but you can observe the gestures, a slight incline of the head, a careful positioning of hands. The exchange feels measured, deliberate, as though each movement carries meaning. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some priests specialized in specific tasks, such as interpreting signs from the natural world or reading patterns believed to hold messages from the divine. You glance at the sky briefly, wondering how much of it might be seen as a text waiting to be read. The priest nods once, then continues on, leaving the group behind. Their expressions shift as they resume speaking, the rhythm returning, though perhaps slightly altered. Oddly enough, many rituals in Babylon were performed daily, not just on special occasions, maintaining a continuous connection between people and their gods. You imagine the repetition of those acts morning and evening, shaping time itself into something patterned and predictable. The street bends, and you follow, noticing how small markers of the sacred appear even outside the temple. A niche in a wall holding a small figurine, a faint trace of ash or residue where something may have been burned. These are not grand displays. They are quiet reminders. A council decree proves that temples often required offerings and contributions, linking religious practice to economic systems in ways that extended far beyond worship alone. The connection between belief and daily life feels deeply woven, not easily separated. You pause near one of the small niches, observing the figurine within. Its features are worn, softened by time, and perhaps by touch. You wonder how many hands have reached toward it, how many quiet hopes have been placed here. No agreement has been reached on how personal or communal religious practice truly was. Some scholars argue that belief was primarily expressed through public ritual, while others suggest a more intimate individual dimension existed alongside it. As you stand here, it feels as though both are present. A faint sound reaches your ears again, similar to what you heard inside the temple. A low chant, or perhaps a recitation, carried just far enough to be noticed but not fully understood. You follow it. It leads you to a small, open space where a few individuals stand in a loose formation. The priest you saw earlier is among them now, their voice blending with the others in a steady cadence. The sound rises and falls gently, like breath shaped into something more structured. You remain at the edge observing. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that not all priests were equally trusted, and that disputes over authority and interpretation could arise even within the sacred sphere. You glance at the group, wondering what conversations exist beyond what is visible. Scholars bicker over how unified religious practice truly was. Were rituals consistent and controlled, or did variations emerge between different temples and regions? The answer seems to drift, like the sound itself, shifting and hard to grasp. The figures complete their recitation, and for a moment there is stillness. Not emptiness, but a pause that feels intentional, as though allowing something unseen to settle. Then slowly they disperse. The priest moves away again, their path leading deeper into the city, their presence continuing to ripple outward in subtle ways. You remain for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle. The scent of incense is faint here, barely present, yet enough to remind you of where you have been. It mixes with the everyday smells of the street, blending the sacred and the ordinary into something inseparable. You begin to walk again, your steps unhurried, and as you do, you start to understand that in Babylon, the sacred is not confined to a single place. It moves. It follows. It appears in small gestures in quiet spaces, in moments that might otherwise pass unnoticed. And in that way, it becomes part of everything, not separate from life, but woven gently through it. The quiet echo of ritual follows you for a while, lingering like a memory that does not quite fade. But then, slowly, your attention begins to lift again, drawn not just to what surrounds you, but to what rises above it. At first, it is only a shift in shadow. Then as you move forward, the structure reveals itself fully. The ziggurat. It towers beyond the surrounding buildings, its stepped form rising in layers that seem to reach deliberately toward the sky. Even from a distance, it feels different, from the temple you entered earlier. Larger, more distant, not in space, but in presence. You slow your steps without thinking. Records confirm that ziggurats in Mesopotamia were monumental structures often associated with temples and believed to serve as a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Standing here looking up at its rising tiers, you begin to understand why that idea took hold. Each level recedes slightly from the one below it, creating a sense of ascent, of movement upward, even while standing still. The surface is made of the same familiar materials, mud brick shaped and layered, but here they feel transformed by scale. A curious footnote drifts into your thoughts. Some ziggurats may have been brightly painted or decorated in ways that have long since faded their surfaces, once far more vivid than what you now imagine. You try to picture it color against sunlight, the structure not just imposing, but striking. As you approach, the space around the base feels more open, as though the city has stepped back to allow the structure room to exist. People move here, but differently. Slower, more aware. Oddly enough, not everyone would have been permitted to ascend the ziggurat. Access to its upper levels was likely restricted to priests or certain officials, reinforcing its role as a place set apart. You glance upward again, imagining the path that winds toward the top unseen from where you stand. A council decree proves that religious and political authority were often intertwined in Babylon, and structures like this served as powerful symbols of that connection. It is not just a building, it is a statement. You place your hand against the base, feeling the warmth of the sun-soaked bricks beneath your fingers. The surface is rough-textured by both construction and time. It grounds the structure, reminding you that even something so vast begins with something as simple as clay. A faint breeze moves across the open space, less obstructed here than in the narrow streets. It carries with it the scent of dust and distant water, blending into something that feels both familiar and expansive. No agreement has been reached on the exact rituals that took place atop these structures. Some scholars suggest offerings to the gods were made in elevated sanctuaries, while others argue that the symbolism of height itself was the primary function. As you look up, the uncertainty feels fitting. The ziggurat does not explain itself. It invites interpretation. A group of figures stands nearby, their gaze also directed upward. They speak quietly, their voices low, as though instinctively adjusting to the presence of something larger than themselves. You follow their gaze, letting your eyes trace the lines of the structure tier by tier, until the top disappears slightly into the brightness of the sky. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that the resources required to build and maintain such monumental structures placed significant demands on the population, raising questions about labor and priority. You glance at the bricks. Again, each one shaped, placed, lifted. Scholars bicker over whether these projects were embraced as acts of devotion or endured as obligations imposed from above. The truth, as always, seems to rest somewhere between reverence and reality. A narrow path leads along the side, not quite inviting, but not entirely closed either. You follow it, part way, your steps slow, your attention fixed on the shifting perspective. As you move, the city below begins to reveal itself in fragments. A rooftop here, a stretch of street there, the movement of people reduced to patterns less individual, more collective. You stop before the path rises, further aware that this is likely as far as you are meant to go. And yet even from here the change is noticeable. The sounds of the city soften slightly, not because they are gone, but because distance reshapes them. The layered voices, the footsteps, the rhythms you have been moving through now blend into something more unified, almost like a single distant pulse. In your ears, it feels calmer. You look out for a moment longer, letting the view settle. Then slowly you step back down, returning to the level of the streets where the details of life sharpen again. The individual voices, the distinct movements, the closeness. But something remains, a sense of scale, of connection between what is below and what is above. And as you move away from the ziggurat, its presence still rising behind you, you carry with you the understanding that in Babylon, the physical world is always reaching towards something more, something higher, something just beyond reach, yet always present in the shape of the city itself. The towering presence of the ziggurat slowly recedes behind you, though it lingers in your thoughts like a shape that does not quite fade. As you return fully to the level of the streets, the details of daily life sharpen again. The closeness, the movement, the quiet patterns that guide each step. And yet now you begin to notice something else, not just how people move, but how they are guided. There is a structure beneath the rhythm, not always visible, but present in the way actions align, in the way disputes are avoided or resolved with a kind of quiet certainty. Law. It does not announce itself loudly, and yet it shapes everything. You pause near a small gathering where two figures stand facing one another, their voices low but firm. Around them, a few others linger, not interfering, simply watching. The tension is subtle, held within gestures rather than raised voices. A disagreement. Records confirm that Babylonian society was governed by detailed legal codes, most famously associated with King Hammurabi, whose laws addressed everything from trade to family matters. As you observe, you begin to see how such rules might live not only in written form, but in shared understanding. One figure gestures toward an object between them, perhaps something exchanged, perhaps something disputed. The other responds with a slight shake of the head, their expression controlled but resolute. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some laws in ancient Babylon specified exact consequences for particular actions, creating a system that aimed for clarity even if its outcomes could feel severe. You glance between the two figures, wondering what expectations shape their exchange. The crowd does not grow restless. There is patience here, a sense that this moment will find its resolution not through chaos, but through a process already known. Oddly enough, many legal matters were settled locally without the need for higher authorities relying on witnesses and community knowledge. You notice how those standing nearby occasionally nod or shift their presence, part of the resolution itself. A council decree proves that contracts were a central part of Babylonian life, often recorded by scribes to formalize agreements. Even here, without visible writing, you sense the weight of such arrangements in the way the two figures speak. One of them lowers their gaze slightly, their posture softening. The other pauses, then gestures again, this time less sharply. Something is changing. No agreement has been reached on how consistently laws were applied across different classes and situations. Some scholars argue for strict enforcement, while others suggest that context and status could influence outcomes. As you watch, the resolution feels both structured and flexible. A third figure steps forward, older, perhaps their presence carrying quiet authority. They do not raise their voice. Instead, they speak briefly, their words measured, their tone calm. The two disputing figures listen. There is a pause. Then almost simultaneously, both nod. The tension dissolves. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are records of harsh punishments in Babylonian law, including severe penalties for certain crimes which have led to debates about fairness and justice. You glance at the now calm scene, wondering how often such severity was truly enacted in daily life. Scholars bicker over whether these laws were meant more as deterrents than as regularly applied punishments. Were they ideals guiding behavior through their existence, or realities shaping lives through direct enforcement? The answer feels as layered as the city itself. The small group begins to disperse the moment, folding back into the larger flow of the street. The two figures who had been in disagreement now stand side by side briefly, their interaction quieter, almost neutral before they part. You notice how quickly the city absorbs such moments. There is no lingering spectacle, no drawn-out attention, just a return to rhythm. Nearby, a man adjusts a bundle, checking its ties with careful hands. A woman passes carrying a vessel, her steps steady. Life continues, shaped by countless small decisions that align with an invisible framework. In your ears, the sounds remain steady, but now they carry a different quality, a sense of order beneath the variation. You begin to understand that law here is not only written on stone or clay tablets, it is carried in memory, in expectation, in the quiet agreement between people about how the world should work. You walk on your pace, even your awareness settled, and as you move through the shifting streets, you carry with you the sense that every interaction, every exchange, every pause holds within it a reflection of that deeper structure, not always seen, not always spoken, but always present, guiding, balancing, and quietly holding the city together. The quiet resolution you witnessed lingers for a while, not as a memory of conflict, but as a sense of balance restored. As you continue walking, the rhythm of the city carries you forward again. But now, your awareness is tuned to something sharper, not just law, but consequence. You do not have to search long before another scene unfolds, one that carries a different tone. A small gathering has formed again, but this time the air feels tighter, more contained. The voices are lower, and the space between people is slightly wider, as though an invisible boundary has been drawn. At the center stands a figure, their posture stiff, their gaze lowered. Nearby, another individual speaks, their tone measured but firm. There is no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, and yet the weight of the moment is clear. Judgment. Records confirm that Babylonian justice often involved local officials or community figures who evaluated disputes and determined outcomes, sometimes based on witness testimony or established law. As you observe, you begin to see how such decisions take shape in real time. A few others stand at the edges watching. Their presence is quiet, but important. Witnesses, observers, participants in a process that extends beyond the individuals directly involved. The figure at the center shifts slightly, their hands tightening briefly before settling again. There is no attempt to flee, no outward resistance, only a stillness that feels both controlled and heavy. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. In some cases, Babylonian law allowed for ordeals, tests believed to reveal truth through divine judgment, though how often these were used remains uncertain. You glance at the scene, wondering what paths led to this moment. The speaker gestures toward an object held by another person, perhaps evidence, perhaps a symbol of the issue at hand. The gesture is deliberate. its meaning understood without explanation. Oddly enough, not all punishments were severe or physical. Some involved compensation repayment or adjustments meant to restore balance rather than simply impose suffering. As you watch, you begin to wonder which form this resolution will take. A council decree proves that specific penalties were outlined for many offenses, creating a framework that aimed to standardize responses, though the reality may have varied. The structure is present here even if you cannot see its full outline. The figure at the center lifts their head slightly, just enough to meet the gaze of the speaker. There is something in that moment, not defiance, not quite acceptance, something in between. No agreement has been reached on how consistently justice was applied across different situations. Some scholars argue that outcomes could be influenced by status or circumstance, while others suggest a stronger adherence to formal codes. As you stand here, the answer feels suspended in the air. A third figure steps forward, similar to the one you saw before, carrying that same quiet authority. They speak briefly, their tone calm, almost neutral. The words seem to settle over the group, shaping what comes next. There is a pause, then a decision. You cannot hear the exact words, but you can see the shift. The figure at the center lowers their gaze again, their shoulders relaxing slightly, as though something has been concluded. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. Some ancient punishments were notably harsh by modern standards, leading to ongoing debates about their purpose and frequency. You glance at the now quiet group, wondering how often such severity truly entered daily life. Scholars bicker over whether these laws were enforced rigidly or adapted in practice. Were they strict guidelines or flexible tools shaped by human judgment? The answer once again feels layered. The group begins to disperse more slowly this time. There is less of a return to casual movement, more of a gradual easing back into the rhythm of the street. The figure who had stood at the center remains for a moment longer, then turns walking away with measured steps. Their path does not seem directed or guided, simply continued. You watch them go, noticing how quickly they become just another presence in the flow of the city. The space they occupied closes. The moment fades. Nearby life resumes its familiar patterns. A vendor adjusts their goods. A child moves past their attention, fixed on something unseen. The layered sounds return, filling the space where silence had briefly settled. In your ears, the rhythm feels steady again, but now it carries an added depth. A recognition that beneath the ordinary flow of life, there are moments like this. Moments where actions meet consequence, where balance is tested and restored. You continue walking your steps, even your thoughts, calm. And as you move through the city once more, you carry with you the understanding that justice here is not distant or abstract. It is immediate, lived, and quietly woven into the fabric of every day. The weight of judgment fades slowly behind you, replaced once more by the softer rhythms of movement and sound. But something in your awareness remains altered. You begin to notice not only what is said or done in this city, but what is preserved, what is remembered. You find yourself drawn toward a quieter part of the street where the noise thins and the light softens against shaded walls. The air here feels slightly different, less charged with motion and more with stillness. There is a sense of order, but of a different kind. Not the order of law, but the order of record. Ahead you hear a faint scratching sound, repetitive, controlled, intentional. You follow it. The space opens into a modest work area where several figures sit or stand with careful focus. Clay tablets rest before them, some already marked with rows of small impressions. Styluses are held with practiced precision pressed into soft clay to form symbols that harden into permanence. Scribes! Records confirm that scribes in Babylon were essential to administration economy and law, trained extensively to master cuneiform writing, one of the earliest known systems of writing in human history. As you watch them work, the importance of that role becomes immediately clear. Each movement of the stylus is deliberate, a press, a shift, a repetition of shapes that seem simple at first, but reveal complexity the longer you observe. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some scribes spent years, even decades, mastering their craft, with training often beginning in specialized schools. You imagine the patience required, the repetition, the discipline of learning to speak through marks in clay. One figure pauses briefly, examining a tablet before making a correction. The clay is still soft enough to adjust, and the change is made with care, not haste. Accuracy matters here. Precision is not optional. Oddly enough, scribes recorded everything from trade transactions to temple offerings to legal agreements and astronomical observations. You glance at the surrounding tablets, wondering how much of daily life is being quietly captured in these impressions. A council decree proves that scribes held a respected position within Babylonian society, often serving as intermediaries between institutions and the public. Their work was not merely administrative, it was foundational. Nearby, another scribe reads aloud softly while copying their voice low, almost blending with the sound of the stylus. The rhythm of speech and writing intertwines as though language itself must be both spoken and fixed to be complete. No agreement has been reached on how widely literacy was distributed in Babylon. Some scholars argue it was restricted to elite groups, while others suggest broader access to basic written knowledge. As you observe the scribes, it feels both specialized and deeply integrated into the fabric of life. A young apprentice sits slightly apart, their posture attentive but uncertain. They hold a stylus with careful hands, pressing it into clay, then hesitating before continuing. The mark they make is imperfect, but it is part of learning, not failure. The mentor nearby does not interrupt immediately. They watch, then gently adjust the angle of the hand, guiding rather than correcting harshly. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are hints that scribal positions could carry influence beyond writing, giving access to information that shape decisions in trade law and governance. You look at the tablets again, aware that knowledge itself holds quiet power. Scholars bicker over how exclusive scribal education truly was. Was it confined to a narrow group carefully guarded, or did opportunities expand over time? The evidence, like the clay impressions themselves, remains partially shaped but not fully clear. A finished tablet is set aside to dry its surface, filled with neatly arranged symbols. You lean slightly closer, not to read, but to observe the density of meaning contained in such small space. Each mark representing a word, a number, an idea, a transaction. Another tablet is being read aloud, possibly verifying its contents. The listener nods occasionally, confirming accuracy. The process feels almost ceremonial in its precision, though entirely practical in purpose. In your ears, the sound of scratching stylus becomes rhythmic again, not chaotic, but steady, like breathing translated into writing. You realize that here memory is not left to chance. It is constructed, preserved, given form. A faint breeze moves through the open space, carrying with it the scent of clay drying in the sun. It is subtle but distinct, a reminder that these records are physical, fragile in their making, yet enduring in their purpose. You step back slightly, allowing the scribes to continue uninterrupted. Their focus does not shift. The work continues whether observed or not. And as you turn away, leaving the quiet discipline of written language behind you, you carry with you a new understanding. That in Babylon words do not simply pass. They are shaped, pressed, and left behind as traces of thought made permanent in clay. The steady rhythm of the scribes fades behind you, but it leaves something behind in your mind, a sense that knowledge here is not only spoken or seen, but carefully preserved, as though the city refuses to let anything meaningful simply drift away. As you continue walking, the streets grow slightly softer in tone. The edges of movement feel less sharp, less defined by obligation or structure. Instead, there is a lighter quality in the air, as though something more spontaneous is unfolding around you. Then you hear it. Laughter. Not loud or chaotic, but bright enough to cut through the layered hum of the city. You follow it instinctively. The path opens into a more relaxed space, where movement feels less directed, more fluid. Here children gather in small groups, their energy shifting constantly from one activity to another. Some sit on the ground, shaping objects from clay. Others chase each other between shaded patches of wall and sunlight. Their world is smaller in scale, but not in intensity. Records confirm that children in Babylon learn through imitation and participation, gradually absorbing the skills and expectations of adult life through daily exposure, rather than formal instruction alone. Watching them, you can see how naturally that process unfolds. A child kneels beside a low surface, carefully pressing a small piece of clay with focused concentration. Their tongue presses slightly against their lip, in effort a detail so ordinary it feels timeless. Nearby, another child watches closely, then attempts the same motion. There is no strict correction, only observation, adjustment, repetition. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some ancient toys discovered by archaeologists suggest that children in Mesopotamia had access to simple play objects, including small figurines and wheeled items. You glance at what the children are using, now wondering which forms of play have survived across time in spirit, if not in shape. Oddly enough, play and learning are not separated here in the way you might expect. A child shaping clay is also preparing for future craft. A child listening to conversations nearby is absorbing language rhythm and social cues. A council decree proves that families were responsible for guiding children into their future roles, though the methods were likely informal and deeply embedded in daily life. You notice how adults nearby occasionally glance over, not intervening but present. One adult sits slightly apart, observing with quiet attention. Their posture suggests familiarity with this scene, perhaps a parent, perhaps simply someone entrusted with care. Their gaze moves between children, tracking progress, behavior, energy. No agreement has been reached on how structured early education truly was in Babylon. Some scholars argue for formalized training in certain contexts, particularly for scribes and craftsmen, while others emphasize informal family-based learning. Here, the truth feels blended, flexible. A group of children suddenly breaks into movement, running in a loose circle. their laughter rising briefly before dissolving into the general sound of the street. The motion is unplanned, yet not chaotic. It follows its own internal logic. You find yourself slowing your steps, watching without intention to interrupt. There is something disarming about their presence, something that softens the layered seriousness of everything you have seen so far. One scandalous aside lingers in your thoughts. There are hints in ancient records that children were sometimes engaged in labor tasks at relatively young ages, depending on household needs. You glance again at the balance between play and responsibility, wondering where one ends and the other begins. Scholars bicker over how early responsibilities were assigned. Were children primarily sheltered during early years or integrated quickly into productive roles? The evidence allows for both interpretations, depending on context and status. A child nearby looks up at you briefly, not with surprise but with curiosity. Their expression is open, unguarded. After a moment, they return to their activity as though your presence is simply another passing feature of the environment. In your ears, the soundscape shifts again. The laughter blends with distant voices, footsteps, and the faint echo of tools from nearby workshops. It is a different kind of rhythm than before, less structured, more scattered, yet still coherent. You notice how quickly attention moves here, from one moment to another, from one game to the next. There is no fixed pace, only flow. A small object rolls across the ground, and two children immediately shift direction to follow it. Their movements, quick but coordinated. For a moment, everything else fades into background. Then it returns. You begin to understand that childhood here is not separate from the city, but embedded within it. Not isolated, but continuously interacting with the world of adults, labor, and learning. And yet, within that integration, there is space. Space for movement, for laughter, for becoming. As you step back from the group, the sound of their play continues behind you, lighter now, drifting rather than pressing. And you carry with you a quiet realization that even in a city defined by structure, responsibility, and order, there are pockets where life unfolds freely, unmeasured, uncontained, and briefly joyfully unbound. The sound of children's laughter fades gradually behind you, but it leaves a lighter feeling in the air, as though the city has briefly loosened its grip on structure. You continue forward, and almost immediately your attention is drawn to something different again. Not sound this time, but appearance, color, fabric, ornament. You begin to notice how carefully people present themselves even in the midst of dust movement and work. Clothing here is not uniform or accidental. It carries intention, identity, subtle signals that tell a story before a word is spoken. A woman passes you wearing a layered garment, its edges trimmed with a slightly darker tone that catches the light when she moves. Her pace is steady, her posture composed. Around her wrist, a simple band glints faintly, not ostentatious, but deliberate. Records confirm that clothing in Babylon served both practical and social purposes, often indicating status, occupation, and sometimes regional origin. As you observe more closely, you begin to see how layered those signals can be. You slow slightly, letting your eyes take in the details. A man nearby wears a simpler tunic, the fabric more worn but still clean. His belt is functional, carrying small tools that suggest work rather than display. Yet even in simplicity there is care. The garment fits properly, adjusted rather than neglected. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some garments in ancient Mesopotamia were made from wool or linen materials that required significant effort to produce. You imagine the process behind each piece. You see the hidden labor embedded in something so ordinary. Oddly enough, jewelry here is not limited to wealth alone. You notice small ornaments worn by people of varying apparent status, suggesting that adornment may have held personal or cultural meaning beyond simple hierarchy. A council decree proves that certain materials and dyes were regulated or valued differently, depending on their availability and production difficulty. Even color itself can carry weight here, though not always in obvious ways. You pass a small group gathered near a doorway where someone is adjusting a sash or fastening a clasp. The motion is careful, almost ritualized. Another person watches, offering brief guidance with a nod or gesture. No agreement has been reached on how strictly clothing distinctions reflected social class in everyday life. Some scholars argue for clear visual markers separating groups, while others suggest more fluid boundaries shaped by context and occasion. As you observe, both possibilities seem to coexist. A woman adjusts a strand of beads around her neck, letting them settle against her chest. The beads are simple, but arranged with intention. She glances briefly at her reflection in a polished surface, then turns away satisfied. One scandalous aside lingers in your thoughts. There are hints that certain garments or ornaments may have been associated with ritual or ceremonial roles, blurring the line between everyday wear and symbolic dress. You look again at the passing figures, wondering what meanings might be hidden in plain sight. Scholars bicker over how much personal expression was allowed in appearance. Was clothing primarily regulated, or did individuals have space to shape their own identity through style? The evidence remains mixed-layered like the fabrics themselves. A child runs past wearing a loosely tied garment, clearly adjusted for ease of movement rather than presentation. Behind them, an adult calls softly adjusting the fabric with quick, practiced hands before letting them go again. You notice how clothing here is not static. It shifts with activity, with need, with role. A worker passes carrying materials over their shoulder, their clothing adapted to movement and labor. Dust clings lightly to the fabric, blending function with environment. There is no attempt to hide it. It is simply part of the day. In your ears, the sound of the city remains steady. But now your attention is divided between movement and appearance, between action and presentation. You begin to realize how much information is communicated without speech. A tilt of fabric, a choice of ornament, the way something is fastened or left loose, all of it speaks. You continue walking, more aware now of how identity is carried through visible detail. And as the street carries you forward, you begin to understand that in Babylon, clothing is not just covering. It is language, quiet, constant, and read without a single word being spoken. The colors and textures of clothing slowly dissolve into the broader movement of the city, and with them, your attention begins to shift again. The air changes subtly as you walk, growing cooler in some places, warmer in others, as though the city itself is breathing in uneven rhythms. Then you notice it, a scent that is sharper than the rest, herbal, earthy, slightly bitter. It draws you forward. You find yourself entering a quieter stretch of street, where activity is more contained, more deliberate. People move here with a different purpose, not trade, not craft, not law, but something more private, more intimate. Healing. A small space opens along the side of the street, where several figures are gathered around a seated individual. The posture of those present is calm, focused. There is no panic, no urgency, only attention. A healer. Records confirm that Babylonian medical practices combined practical herbal remedies with ritual and spiritual interpretation, reflecting a worldview where physical and spiritual well-being were deeply intertwined. As you observe that blending becomes visible in small, careful actions, a bowl is held steady. While a mixture is prepared, the contents stirred slowly with measured precision. Nearby, dried plants are arranged in small bundles, each likely chosen for a specific purpose. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some ancient Mesopotamian texts describe symptoms and treatments in surprisingly systematic ways, suggesting early attempts at categorizing illness. You glance at the scene, wondering how much observation shaped these practices. The seated individual shifts slightly, their movement restrained, careful. A hand is placed gently on their arm, not restraining, but steadying. The gesture is calm, reassuring. Oddly enough, illness here is not always seen as purely physical. It may be interpreted through multiple layers of meaning, including spiritual imbalance or external influence. You notice how those attending the person move between practical action and quiet spoken phrases. A council decree proves that healers in Babylon often held recognized roles within society, sometimes working alongside temple authorities or within household settings. Their knowledge existed at the intersection of observation and tradition. A small vessel is lifted, and a portion of liquid is carefully administered. The action is slow, deliberate. The observer leans slightly forward, watching for reaction, for change. No agreement has been reached on how advanced Babylonian medical knowledge truly was. Some scholars emphasize empirical observation in treatments, while others highlight the strong presence of ritual explanation. Standing here, both seem present at once. A faint sound of soft chanting or spoken words accompanies the process, low enough to blend into the background, but steady enough to suggest intention. It is not loud. It is controlled, measured. You step slightly closer, careful not to disturb the space. The air here feels different again, carrying not just scent, but expectation. A sense that something is in the process of shifting. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are indications that some treatments were accompanied by incantations or ritual practices intended to influence outcomes beyond physical remedies. You glance at the healer's hands, wondering where technique ends and belief begins. Scholars bicker over how much of Babylonian healing was practical versus symbolic. Were herbs and remedies effective in their own right, or did ritual play an equally essential role in perceived recovery? The answer resists separation. The seated individual exhales slowly, their shoulders easing slightly. It is not dramatic, but there is a subtle change in tension. Those around them notice their expressions adjusting in small ways. A cloth is gently adjusted over their shoulders, offering warmth or comfort. The motion is careful, attentive, not rushed. You realize how quiet this process is. There is no spectacle, no dramatic intervention, only small, repeated acts of care. In your ears, the surrounding city feels distant for a moment, as though this space has narrowed the world to a few essential movements. Breath, touch, attention. A final adjustment is made to the mixture and the bowl is set aside. The healer observes in silence, waiting, not forcing, simply allowing time to do its work. You begin to understand that healing here is not only about outcome, It is about process, presence, and the careful balance between what can be done and what must unfold naturally. As you step back from the space, allowing it to continue without your presence, the scent of herbs lingers briefly, then fades into the broader air of the city, and you carry with you the sense that even in moments of vulnerability, Babylon responds not with urgency alone, but with quiet, structured care. A reminder that life here is always being tended, in many forms, at many levels, often unseen, but deeply felt. The scent of herbs and quiet healing fades gradually as you move away, blending back into the wider atmosphere of the city. But it leaves behind a softness in your awareness, a sense that even suffering here is held within a structured calm rather than chaos. You continue walking. The soundscape begins to change again. Not louder, not sharper, but layered differently. There is a faint crackle in the air now, a subtle rhythm that feels less like speech or work, and more like atmosphere itself being shaped. Then you notice it. Fragrance, incense. It arrives in waves drifting through narrow openings between buildings, rising from unseen sources before dissolving into the sunlit air. You follow it without hesitation. The street narrows slightly, and the light becomes more textured, filtered through hanging materials and partial coverings stretched between walls. The scent deepens here, becoming more complex. Resin, smoke, something sweet beneath it all. Records confirm that incense played an important role in Babylonian ritual life, often used in temples and sacred spaces to create an atmosphere of reverence and transition. As you breathe it in, you begin to understand why it carried meaning beyond simple fragrance. It changes the air itself. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some ancient incense mixtures included imported ingredients traveling long distances before arriving here. You imagine the journey contained within each inhalation, distant landscapes compressed into scent. A small space opens ahead where a faint glow of burning material is visible. The source is not dramatic. No large fire, no spectacle, just a controlled burning in a shallow vessel tended carefully by a seated figure. Their movements are slow, deliberate. They add small amounts of material at intervals, watching the smoke rise and disperse. Oddly enough, incense here is not only tied to ritual, but also to marking time and transition-shaping moments that feel distinct from ordinary activity. You notice how people passing through this space naturally slow their pace, their voices lowering without instruction. A council decree proves that temple rituals often included offerings of incense, alongside other materials, reinforcing its role in maintaining structured spiritual practice. Even here outside a formal temple, that structure is still present in subtle form. A few figures stand nearby, their heads slightly inclined, not speaking loudly. There is a shared awareness that this is a space of pause rather than action. No agreement has been reached on whether incense use in Babylon was primarily symbolic, practical, or sensory in purpose. Some scholars argue it was meant to mask odors in dense urban environments, while others emphasize its ritual significance. As you stand here, it feels like all of these meanings coexist. The smoke rises in thin streams, twisting gently before dissolving into the air above. You watch its movement, noticing how it responds to the slightest shift in wind, never fixed, always changing. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that certain aromatic substances used in rituals were highly valuable, controlled, or restricted due to their rarity. You glance at the small vessel, imagining the value contained within something so intangible. Scholars bicker over how accessible such materials truly were. Were they limited to elite or temple contexts, or did broader segments of society participate in their use in smaller ways? The evidence remains scattered, like the smoke itself. A figure nearby gently adjusts the burning material, causing a brief increase in fragrance. The shift is subtle but noticeable, and those closest to it instinctively pause as though acknowledging the change. You realize how carefully this environment is maintained. Nothing is accidental. Every addition, every pause, every adjustment shapes the experience of those passing through. In your ears, the city feels quieter here, not because sound is absent, but because it is softened by this sensory layer. The scent seems to slow perception to create a different kind of awareness. A child passes by holding onto an adult's hand, their movement slightly slower than before. They glance briefly toward the source of the incense, then continue without stopping, already accustomed to its presence. You find yourself lingering a moment longer, letting the smoke drift across your field of vision. It breaks and reforms, never holding a single shape for long. Then gradually, you step back. The scent begins to thin as you move away, replaced again by the broader mix of dust movement and daily life. But something remains, a lingering impression that not all spaces in the city are defined by function alone. Some are shaped by atmosphere, by intention, by the quiet shaping of perception itself. And as you return fully to the flow of the street, you carry with you the understanding that even the air in Babylon can be crafted gently, deliberately, and with meaning that goes beyond what can be seen. The scent of incense fades behind you, but it does not fully leave your awareness. It lingers, like a memory, embedded in fabric subtle but persistent, as you step back into the fuller rhythm of the city. And then almost without transition, the atmosphere shifts again. This time it is sound that leads you, not the steady hum of labor or the measured exchange of trade, but something more layered, more expressive, a rising pattern that seems to weave through the streets rather than simply pass through them. Music! At first it is distant, a faint pulse of rhythm that could almost be mistaken for coincidence. Then it grows clearer, joined by other tones, forming something structured, something intentional. You follow it. The street opens into a broader space where movement feels more fluid, less constrained. People gather here in loose formations, not for transaction or dispute, but for something different, something shared, a celebration. Records confirm that festivals and communal gatherings were an important part of Babylonian life, often tied to religious calendars, seasonal cycles, and civic identity. As you approach, you begin to see how such events blur the boundaries between ritual and joy. A group of musicians sits near the center of the space. One holds a stringed instrument, its surface catching light as their fingers move across it. Another produces sound through a reed-like instrument, its tone rising and falling in soft waves. A third keeps rhythm with a percussion surface steady and grounding. The result is not overwhelming. It is layered. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some instruments found in ancient Mesopotamia suggest a surprisingly developed understanding of harmony and rhythm, though the exact musical system remains partly speculative. You listen closely, trying to discern patterns that feel both unfamiliar and instinctively structured. Around the musicians, people move in gentle patterns. Some sway slightly. Others stand in groups talking quietly between bursts of sound. There is no rigid formation, no strict choreography, yet the movement feels connected. Oddly enough, Music here does not always separate performer and audience in the way you might expect. Participation is fluid, presence is shared. You notice how easily people shift between listening and engaging. A council decree proves that certain festivals in Babylon were state-supported, involving coordinated offerings, processions, and communal activities that reinforced both civic and religious identity. Even in this more relaxed atmosphere, that underlying structure is present. A woman nearby claps softly in time with the rhythm, her expression relaxed, almost reflective. A child imitates the movement beside her, slightly offbeat, but fully engaged in the moment. No agreement has been reached on how complex Babylonian musical theory truly was. Some scholars argue for relatively simple tonal systems, while others suggest more advanced structures influenced later musical traditions. As you listen, the depth feels intuitive rather than explained. The sound rises briefly, then softens, then rises again. It is not constant. It breathes. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are hints that music and performance could sometimes be used in ceremonial or political contexts, shaping perception and reinforcing authority. You glance around, wondering how often joy and structure overlap without clear separation. Scholars bicker over whether these gatherings were primarily spontaneous expressions of community or carefully organized events with deeper institutional purpose. The truth feels suspended within the rhythm itself. A small group begins a simple coordinated movement, not quite dance in a formal sense, but synchronized enough to suggest shared understanding. Their steps are light, unforced, guided more by sound than instruction. You find yourself slowing again, not out of obligation, but because the space invites it. The air feels different here, less segmented, more continuous, as though sound and movement and presence are all part of the same unfolding moment. In your ears, the instruments blend into something soothing rather than demanding. The repetition of rhythm becomes grounding, almost meditative. A faint smile passes across someone's face nearby. As they listen, their attention momentarily lifted away from everything else. It is brief, but noticeable. You begin to see how this gathering functions not only as entertainment, but as a kind of release, a shared space where daily structure loosens, even if only temporarily. Then slowly the rhythm begins to shift again, not ending, but transitioning, softening at the edges. People start to disperse in small groups, conversations forming as the music continues at a lower intensity. You step back slightly, letting the space continue without you. And as you move away, the sound follows briefly, then fades into the broader noise of the city. But it leaves something behind, a lightness, a reminder that within a world shaped by labor law and structure, there are moments where rhythm itself becomes a form of connection, not spoken, not written, but shared in sound movement and presence. The last echoes of music dissolve into the wider hum of Babylon, and for a moment everything feels slightly softer, as though the city is exhaling after its brief celebration. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of the streets guide you without resistance. But gradually, something begins to change. The light shifts, not dramatically, but enough for you to notice. Shadows lengthen subtly against the walls, stretching a little farther than before. The heat of the day begins to lose its sharpness, replaced by a gentler warmth. You are moving toward evening. The streets, once filled with overlapping activity, begin to reorganize themselves, not into silence, but into a slower version of themselves. Fewer hurried footsteps, more deliberate pacing, conversations that soften rather than conclude. Records confirm that daily cycles in ancient Babylon were closely tied to natural light and temperature shaping when people worked, gathered, and rested. As you observe the shift, it feels less like time passing and more like the city adjusting its breath. A faint glow appears in small pockets along the street, lamps being prepared, fires carefully tended, not yet fully active but readying themselves for the coming darkness. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some households used simple oil lamps to extend activity after sunset, allowing work and conversation to continue beyond daylight hours. You imagine the slow transition from sunlit movement to flickering interior light. Oddly enough, the mood of the city does not become tense as night approaches. Instead, it feels measured, anticipated, as though darkness is not an interruption but a familiar phase. A council decree proves that certain activities were regulated according to time of day, with night bringing different patterns of security, labor, and social behavior. Even now, you can sense that transition beginning to take shape. A group of figures passes you carrying tools, their steps unhurried. Another group moves in the opposite direction, returning from work or gathering supplies. The flow is still present, but it has changed direction like a tide shifting inward. No agreement has been reached on how urban life at night in Babylon was perceived by its inhabitants. Some scholars suggest it was quieter and more restricted, while others argue that activity continued in many sectors. As you walk, both impressions seem partially true. A faint sound of a closing door reaches you, followed by another. Not abrupt, but rhythmic in its own way. A soft settling of spaces, one scandalous aside, lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that night could carry different risks, from reduced visibility to increased vulnerability in certain areas of the city. You glance down the narrowing street, noticing how attention seems to sharpen even as movement slows. Scholars bicker over how safe or active Babylon truly was after dark. Was it a time of retreat and caution, or simply a continuation of daily life under different conditions? The answer feels embedded in the gradual dimming of light itself. A woman passes carrying a small lamp, its flame steady despite the movement. The glow touches her face briefly, then falls back into shadow as she moves on. The light does not dominate the space, but it defines it. You notice how sound changes again. Voices become less frequent, but more distinct. Footsteps echo slightly differently against the ground. Even the air feels quieter, though not empty. You begin to understand that this transition is not abrupt. It is layered, each element of the city adjusting at its own pace, creating a slow transformation rather than a sudden shift. A child is led gently by an adult, their steps slightly slower now, their attention drifting between surroundings and sleepiness. The interaction is quiet, protective, habitual. In your ears, the city's rhythm becomes more spaced, more intentional. The density of daytime life gives way to intervals of calm. You realize that evening here is not an end, but a reconfiguration, a rebalancing of energy, of movement, of attention. As you continue walking, the first true hints of night settle over Babylon, not as darkness alone, but as a different kind of order emerging from the fading light. And in that transition you feel the city preparing not to stop, but to change its form once again. The last traces of daylight slip further behind the rooftops, and Babylon begins to feel different in your awareness. Not quieter in a complete sense, but more concentrated, as though the city has drawn its attention inward. The lamps you noticed earlier are now fully alive, Small points of warm light appear along walls inside doorways near gathering spaces. They do not overpower the darkness. They punctuate it, each one marking a place where life continues under a different kind of visibility. You walk more slowly, now your senses adjusting to the softer contrasts. Shadows deepen between buildings, and the sounds of the city shift again. Less layered, more separated. A voice here, a footstep there. The occasional low call from a distance that fades before it can be answered. Records confirm that ancient cities like Babylon developed distinct nighttime rhythms where movement continued, but with greater awareness of risk and visibility. As you observe, that awareness feels present in the way people carry themselves. A man passes you carrying a lit lamp, his other hand free but ready. His gaze moves constantly, not fearful, but attentive. He acknowledges your presence with a brief nod before continuing on. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some lamps in Mesopotamia were designed to minimize smoke or conserve oil, reflecting practical adaptations to extended use after sunset. You notice how carefully each flame is shielded from wind and movement. Oddly enough, darkness here is not absolute. It is layered with controlled light, creating pockets of visibility rather than uniform shadow. A council decree proves that certain areas of the city likely had increased watchfulness at night, whether through appointed guards or community responsibility. You begin to notice subtle signs of that structure as you move forward. A figure stands at a corner stationary, their posture alert but calm, not blocking movement, not directing it, simply observing. Their presence is quiet but noticeable, like a fixed point in the shifting darkness. No agreement has been reached on how extensive nighttime security measures were in Babylon. Some scholars suggest formalized systems, while others believe much of it relied on local familiarity and informal vigilance. As you pass the figure, the truth feels balanced between both ideas. A narrow alley opens briefly to your left, and you catch a glimpse of a small interior space lit by a single lamp. Inside, people continue tasks that were begun earlier in the day, folding, repairing, speaking softly. Life does not stop, it simply contracts into smaller spaces. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are hints that certain activities may have been restricted or more carefully monitored at night, depending on location and status. You glance again at the shifting patterns of movement, wondering how much is visible regulation and how much is habit. Scholars bicker over whether Babylonian nights were primarily times of rest or continued productivity. Was the city designed to slow, or did it simply adapt its pace without truly pausing? The evidence feels divided like the light itself. A group of figures passes together, sharing a single lamp between them. Their shadows overlap on the wall, stretching and compressing with each step. There is something almost choreographed in their movement, though unplanned. You notice how conversations now tend to be shorter, more purposeful. Words spoken only when necessary. Silence filling the spaces between. The air feels cooler, carrying less of the day's heat and more of the ground's stored warmth, releasing slowly into the night. It creates a subtle balance, neither harsh nor still. In your ears, the city is no longer a continuous flow. It has become a series of moments, isolated, defined, each sound carrying more weight because of its separation. You realize that at night, Babylon does not disappear. It condenses, becoming a collection of illuminated points connected by shadowed paths. A small child clings to an adult's hand as they move past you, their steps slower, their attention partially inward. The adult adjusts their grip slightly, guiding them gently through the dimness. You continue walking, more aware now of how light itself shapes behavior, where people gather, how they move, what they avoid. And as you move deeper into the night-lit streets, you understand something quietly. That darkness here is not absence. It is structure, shaped by flame, by movement, and by the careful negotiation between what is seen and what is left in shadow. The night settles more fully now, and Babylon reveals yet another version of itself. The lamps continue to glow in scattered constellations along the streets, but between them stretches a softer darkness, not threatening but watchful in its own quiet way. You walk more carefully here, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Every sound feels closer, every movement more distinct. Yet the city does not feel empty. It feels reorganized. A steady movement draws your attention ahead. A small caravan of figures moves along a wider street, their pace measured, their belongings carefully secured. The soft creak of wood and leather blends with the occasional murmur of voices. Trade does not end with daylight. Records confirm that Babylon was connected to extensive trade routes that extended far beyond its walls, linking regions through rivers, roads, and intermediary cities. Even at night, you can sense that continuity in motion. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some goods found in Babylonian contexts originated from distant lands, suggesting long chains of exchange that spanned great distances and multiple cultures. You imagine those journeys now continuing through darkness, guided by familiarity rather than light. Oddly enough, night travel in ancient cities often depended on knowledge of paths rather than visibility alone. You notice how the figures ahead move with confidence, as though the route is already embedded in memory. A council decree proves that merchants and travelers were sometimes required to follow specific regulations when moving goods, especially valuable or sensitive items. Even here, in reduced light, structure remains present. You step slightly aside as the group passes. Their lamp casts shifting patterns across the ground, briefly illuminating textures in the earth before fading again. No agreement has been reached on how extensive long-distance trade activity was during nighttime hours specifically. Some scholars suggest limited movement due to risk, while others argue that experienced traders may have preferred cooler night conditions for travel. Watching this passage, both ideas feel plausible. A faint sound of hooves reaches you from another direction, followed by the low voice of someone guiding an animal. The rhythm is steady, unhurried, adapted to reduced visibility. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that certain trade goods may have been transported under varying levels of oversight, depending on their value or origin, raising questions about control and flexibility within the system. You glance at the moving figures, considering how much trust is embedded in motion itself. Scholars bicker over how tightly regulated long-distance trade routes truly were. Were they strictly monitored, or did they rely heavily on established networks and reputation? The answer seems to move like the caravans themselves, between structure and openness. The street widens slightly, and you notice more scattered activity here than before. Not crowds, but clusters. Small groups gathered near lit areas, exchanging goods, speaking in low tones, adjusting loads. A man checks the fastening on a bundle, tightening it with careful hands. Another adjusts a strap on a pack animal, ensuring balance. These are not hurried actions. They are practiced. You realize how much trust is required for movement at night. Trust in routes, in people, in systems that function even when visibility is reduced. The lamps around you flicker slightly with passing air currents, their flames steady but responsive. Each one marks a temporary boundary between known and unknown space. In your ears, the sounds of trade are softer now, but still present. A word exchanged, a payment counted, a brief agreement reached and confirmed. You begin to see how trade here is not confined to markets or daylight hours. It is continuous, shifting form depending on time, but never truly stopping. A figure passes close to you, carrying a container marked with simple impressions. Their movement is cautious but familiar, suggesting repetition of this path many times before. You step further into a dimmer stretch of street, where the lamps are fewer and the shadows longer. Yet even here, movement persists. Life adapts rather than retreats. And as you continue walking through the layered darkness of Babylon, you carry with you the understanding that connection in this city does not depend on light alone. It depends on memory, on roots known by repetition, and on the quiet confidence that even in reduced visibility, the world remains connected by movement that does not pause, only transforms. The rhythm of movement in the night streets gradually thins, not disappearing, but spacing itself out like breaths between longer silences. The lamps remain your guides, small steady points of warmth against the surrounding dark, each one marking another pocket of continued life. And yet, as you walk further, something begins to feel different, less immediate, more distant, not in space but in presence. You notice it in the way people speak now when they pass, more cautiously, more selectively. Conversations are shorter, more purposeful, as though words themselves are being weighed more carefully in the night air. Then you see it, a larger structure ahead, partially lit, partially swallowed by shadow. Its form is less monumental than the ziggurat you saw earlier, but it carries a different kind of weight. Not vertical reach, but quiet authority. A residence of power, records confirm that Babylonian kingship was deeply embedded in both political and religious systems, with rulers seen not only as administrators, but as figures maintaining order on behalf of divine authority. As you approach, that idea feels less like abstraction and more like atmosphere. The building does not announce itself loudly. There are no grand gestures here, not at this hour. Instead, there is controlled illumination, guards positioned at intervals, movement that is measured, deliberate. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some royal residences in ancient Mesopotamia were designed not only for living, but for administrative function, housing scribes, officials, and messengers within the same complex. You imagine the layers of activity contained within these walls, even at night. A figure stands near the entrance, their posture straight, their presence unmistakably official. They do not block passage, but they regulate it. Each person who approaches is briefly observed, acknowledged, then either allowed forward or directed elsewhere. You slow your steps without consciously deciding to. Oddly enough, authority here is not always loud or visible. It is often expressed through stillness, through control of space rather than constant motion. A council decree proves that the king's authority in Babylon extended through appointed officials who manage different aspects of governance, from taxation to law enforcement. Even at night, that structure does not fully relax. You remain at a respectful distance, observing. A messenger arrives, moving quickly but not chaotically. Their pace suggests urgency contained within discipline. They approach the entrance, exchange a brief interaction with a guard, then are allowed through without hesitation. Inside, light flickers faintly from deeper within the structure. Not the open communal light of the streets, but a more contained glow, as though activity continues behind layers of controlled space. No agreement has been reached on how centralized decision-making truly was in Babylon at different periods. Some scholars suggest strong royal oversight, while others argue that administrative power was distributed among various institutions and officials. Watching this moment, both interpretations feel present at once. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are hints that access to royal spaces was highly restricted, with only certain individuals permitted entry depending on role, status, or purpose. You glance at the controlled movement at the entrance, recognizing how carefully boundaries are maintained. Scholars bicker over how directly the king engaged with daily administrative matters. Was rule highly personal and immediate, or filtered through layers of officials? The answer seems to exist somewhere within the structure itself, not easily separated. A second figure exits the building, slower than the messenger, carrying what appears to be a sealed object or document. Their movements are careful, deliberate, as though the contents require protection even from casual observation. You notice how silence gathers here, not emptiness, but concentration. Even ambient sounds feel reduced, as though the space absorbs distraction. The night air feels slightly cooler now, and the contrast between the illuminated entrance and surrounding darkness becomes more pronounced. Light does not spread widely here. It defines boundaries. In your ears, the city feels different again, less like a continuous flow, more like a network of controlled points. Lamps, entrances, guarded thresholds, moments of passage. You realize that power here is not distant. It is structured into space, into access, into movement itself. A final glance toward the building reveals another figure briefly visible within, then disappearing deeper inside. Life continues here, but in layers you cannot fully see. You step back slowly, allowing the structure to recede into shadow once more. And as you return to the quieter flow of the night streets, you carry with you the understanding that in Babylon, authority is not only held, it is arranged, carefully, quietly, and always present even when partially hidden from view. You leave the edge of power behind you, but the feeling of structured presence does not fully fade. It simply shifts, dispersing into smaller, quieter forms as you move deeper into the night-lit streets. The city is calmer now, not asleep, just softened. Lamps continue to glow in scattered points, but between them the darkness feels more open, less interrupted. The rhythm of footsteps is slower, more spaced out. Conversations are rare, and when they happen, they are brief and close to the body, as though the night encourages discretion. You begin to notice something else now, something more intimate in scale. Homes, not as structures, but as lived spaces. A partially open doorway reveals a softly lit interior where a woman sits adjusting fabric under the glow of a small lamp. Her movements are unhurried, almost reflective. Nearby, another figure rests against a wall, eyes half closed, listening to the quiet sounds of the room. Records confirm that Babylonian households often functioned as both private living spaces and centers of daily production and family life, blurring the boundary between domestic and economic activity. As you observe these glimpses, that blending becomes unmistakable. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some homes contained multiple generations living together with roles distributed across age and ability rather than strict separation. You imagine the layered presence within these walls, each person contributing in different ways. Oddly enough, night in Babylon does not erase activity entirely. It compresses it into interior spaces, drawing life inward rather than outward. A council decree proves that family structures and inheritance laws played a significant role in defining household responsibilities, shaping how property roles and obligations were passed and maintained. Even in these quiet moments, that framework underlies what you see. A child sits near a lamp, tracing patterns in dust or clay with slow, absent-minded movements. An adult nearby watches briefly, then returns to their own task. There is no urgency here, only continuity. No agreement has been reached on how much nighttime domestic activity differed between social groups in Babylon. Some scholars suggest wealthier households experienced greater separation between work and rest, while others argue that most homes shared similar rhythms regardless of status. Watching these scenes, the boundary feels subtle rather than fixed. A faint sound of water being poured reaches you from inside another home. A soft exchange of words follows, then silence again. The actions are small, almost invisible, unless you are paying attention. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are suggestions that household roles, particularly for women, could involve both domestic responsibilities and economic contributions, such as textile production or small-scale trade. You glance again at the softly lit interiors, recognizing how interconnected these roles can be. Scholars bicker over how rigid gender roles truly were in everyday Babylonian life. Were they strictly defined or adaptable depending on circumstance and household need? The evidence feels layered, much like the overlapping shadows on the walls. A man steps briefly outside, adjusts something near the entrance, then returns inside without speaking. The doorway closes slightly, leaving only a thin line of light visible. You continue walking, passing these pockets of domestic life, one by one, each one different in detail, yet similar in rhythm. A lamp, a seated figure, a quiet task, a shared space. You begin to see how night here is not absence of activity, but concentration of it, reduced to its most essential forms. In your ears, the soundscape is minimal now. Occasional movement, a distant voice, the soft friction of fabric or footsteps on earth. And within that quiet, something becomes clear. Babylon does not divide sharply between public and private, between work and rest, between activity and stillness. Instead, it flows between them, adjusting continuously, like breath moving through different depths. As you pass another softly lit doorway, you feel less like an observer moving through a sleeping city, and more like someone passing through layers of ongoing life, each one slightly dimmed, but still fully present. The night has now fully settled over Babylon, not as silence, but as a gentler version of itself. The city does not disappear into darkness. It reorganizes, pulling its energy inward, concentrating life into smaller, quieter pockets of presence. You continue walking, and gradually the rhythm shifts again, not toward work, not toward authority, but toward something more final, more reflective. You begin to notice small details that you might have passed earlier in the day without thought. A carefully placed object near a doorway, a quiet arrangement of offerings, a figure standing still for longer than expected, not engaged in motion, but in contemplation. There is a different weight to these moments. a sense of closure. Records confirm that burial practices in Babylon were closely tied to both family responsibility and religious belief, often involving careful preparation of the body and offerings intended to support the journey beyond life. As you move through the night streets, that awareness subtly changes how you perceive even the quietest corners. A faint scent of earth and something faintly resinous drifts through the air, not incense used in celebration, but something more subdued, more solemn. You slow your steps. A small gathering stands near a partially enclosed space. The light here is dim but steady. A single lamp casts long, soft shadows against the walls. Figures move carefully, their actions restrained, respectful. A body is being prepared. The process is not dramatic. There is no spectacle, no urgency, only careful, practiced movement. Cloth is adjusted. Objects are placed with intention. Words are spoken softly, almost in fragments. A curious footnote rises in your thoughts. Some ancient Mesopotamian burial customs involved placing personal items with the deceased, reflecting beliefs about continuity beyond physical life. You observe the quiet arrangement of objects nearby, each one chosen with care. Oddly enough, death here is not treated as rupture alone, but as transition. A shift from one state of existence to another managed through ritual and family responsibility. A council decree proves that burial practices were likely governed by both tradition and social expectation, ensuring that even in death, individuals were placed within a structured framework of remembrance and care. You remain at a respectful distance, not intruding but observing the quiet discipline of the moment. No agreement has been reached on how uniform Babylonian burial beliefs were across different regions or social groups. Some scholars suggest variation in practice depending on status and resources, while others emphasize shared symbolic structures. What you see feels both specific and universal at once. A family member adjusts something near the body, their movement slow, deliberate. There is no visible collapse of emotion, only a contained stillness, as though grief here is expressed through action rather than display. One scandalous aside lingers at the edge of your thoughts. There are hints that burial arrangements could vary significantly depending on economic means, affecting the complexity of rituals or offerings included. You glance again at the careful placement of items, aware of how deeply inequality can extend even into final moments. Scholars bicker over how standardized funerary practices truly were. Were they consistent across the city or shaped heavily by household capacity and belief? The answer feels layered, like everything else you have seen. A faint sound of fabric shifting, a soft inhale, a pause. In movement, the scene remains steady, unbroken, held within its own quiet gravity. You notice how the surrounding street has become even calmer here. Fewer passers-by, less movement, as though the city itself acknowledges the boundary of this space. In your ears, the usual rhythm of Babylon feels distant, muted, almost respectful in its withdrawal. You begin to understand that death here is not hidden away entirely, but it is contained, given space, handled with structure, care, and ritual continuity. As you slowly step back from the scene, the lamplight grows smaller behind you, absorbed into the night, and you carry with you a quiet awareness that in Babylon even endings are not abrupt. They are guided, marked, and gently woven into the ongoing fabric of life. The solemn quiet of the burial space remains behind you as you move forward, but it does not feel like an ending to what you have witnessed. Instead, It settles into the background of everything else, another layer within the city's vast and continuous rhythm. Babylon is quieter now than it was at midday, but it is not still. It never truly becomes still. You walk through streets that feel more open in their silence, where lamps burn low and steady, and where shadows stretch longer across the earth. The city is no longer defined by urgency or celebration or judgment or trade. It is something softer now, more inward, more reflective. And in that quiet, you begin to see everything you have witnessed not as separate moments, but as parts of a single living system. Walls that shaped entry and belonging, courtyards that held family life, wells that sustained water and survival, markets that carried sound and exchange, temples that layered meaning into daily existence, law that structured consequence and order, writing that preserved memory beyond breath, work that gave form to clay metal and cloth, fields that stretched beyond the walls, feeding the whole, children learning through imitation and play, clothing speaking without words, healing, balancing uncertainty with care, incense shaping perception itself, music dissolving boundaries into shared rhythm, night drawing life inward into condensed spaces, authority organizing presence even in shadow, trade extending connections far beyond sight, family and hierarchy quietly shaping interaction, justice restoring balance through structured decision, remembrance carrying life into what comes after. All of it layered, all of it continuous. You realize there was never a single Babylon in what you have seen. There were many, one built in light and another in shadow, one in movement, one in stillness, one in collective gathering, and one in private interior spaces where life unfolded more quietly. And yet none of them existed separately. They were always the same city, simply expressed in different rhythms. A faint breeze moves through the street, carrying the last remaining warmth of the day. A distant lamp flickers, steadies, continues. Somewhere far off, a soft sound echoes indistinct but present, like life refusing to fully settle into silence. Records confirm that Babylon endured through shifting dynasties, changing rulers, and evolving cultural practices, yet remained a central symbol of urban civilization in Mesopotamia for centuries. That endurance feels present now, not as history, but as atmosphere. A curious footnote rises gently in your thoughts. Even after decline and transformation, the idea of Babylon continued to exist in later memory and storytelling reshaped by those who came after. You wonder how much of what you have experienced here will remain in your own memory once the moment passes. No agreement has been reached on what truly defined Babylon. Most, the grandeur of its monuments, the structure of its systems, or the quiet persistence of daily life within its walls. Perhaps it is not one answer, but all of them at once. You slow your steps. The city does not ask you to leave. It simply continues, regardless of your presence, as it always has. And in that realization, there is a gentle clarity. Babylon is not a moment in time. It is a pattern of living, a repetition of human presence expressed through thousands of small, interconnected acts. As you stand in the softly lit night, one last time, you no longer feel like a visitor moving through a city, but like someone who has briefly been allowed to observe the shape of a world from within. Then you begin to walk again, and slowly the sounds, lights, and rhythms of Babylon continue on without you fading not into absence, but into distance, still existing, still moving, still living sweet dreams.